Greetings, my fellow Westorians. I'm Aziz. With me is Ashea, and this is Valar Rereadis, where we look for the foreshadowing we missed, new depth in the world building, a better understanding of the plot lines, greater familiarity with the characters, and more fun than you can fit in all 7 hells. It's episode 9 of 11. Don't forget that there will be no Valar Rereadis for 3 weeks, but we will still have new episodes going up during that span. After we finish A Game of Thrones, but before A Clash of Kings, we'll have a wrap-up Q&A with guests Lady Gwyn and Sir Buckley. It will be part of the regular Valar Rereadis schedule, meaning it'll be on a Sunday, most likely at 3 Eastern, like all the others have been. This time, we have Sansa IV, the Gang Gaslights Sansa about her father, aka the one where they get Sansa to write letters or else she's a traitor.
Jon VII, the one where Jon saves Mormont, aka the gang fights dead rangers.
Bran VI, the one where Greatjon drops 2 digits, aka the gang calls the banners.
Daenerys VI, the one with the poison wine cellar, aka the Khal promises to lead the gang to Westeros.
Catelyn VIII, the gang marches with the northern host, aka the one where Cat says you win or we die.
Tyrion VII, the one where the clans meet the Lannisters, aka the gang meets Tywin.
Sansa V, the one where the Lannisters take over, aka the gang fires Sir
Barristan.Eddard XV, the one where Varys convinces Ned to admit treason, aka the gang drinks wine in the black cells.
You may have noticed there are 8 this time. We needed to do 8 this time to get it to divide evenly. And even though Sansa only has 6 chapters in the whole book, 2 of them are today. And we also have Ned's sigh. Last chapter. It's a set of chapters heavy on resolution. Many of the things set up previously in other chapters are coming to roost now. There's a lot of Barristan in this episode too. Our first look at Tywin, or re-look at Tywin rather, and several northern characters. Lots of them are getting ready for war, not only in the north, but in the south. So we start with Sansa IV, the gang gaslights Sansa about her father, aka the one where they get Sansa to write letters, or else she's a traitor. It's hard to blame Sansa for how this one goes down. I mean, it's a room full of plotters, people who are much better at this, much more experienced at this, much more, lacking in scruples. Cersei, Littlefinger, Varys, even Pycelle, they're all arrayed against her and they have leverage. This is really overwhelming.
They came for Sansa on the 3rd day.
That's how it starts, and Sansa thinks that Jane is acting like a child because she's been crying for 3 days, while Sansa only cried the first day. This is probably or possibly meant as tragic irony because this moment comes as Sansa is trying to get Jane to stop crying by telling her that she'll ask Cersei to let Jane see her father Vion. Jane may know what Sansa doesn't, that Vion is quite dead, along with Septa Mordane, Tom, Alan, and so many others. Joe Buckley points out that Jane, if we had her POV, might be thinking, no, you're the one acting like a child, Sansa. The next Sansa chapter is one we've nicknamed the one where the Lannisters take over, aka the gang fire Sir Barristan. But the signs are already there in this one. It's pretty clear. The lions are everywhere and the stags are not. And hardly anyone else is. Sir Boros comes for her, someone already referred to as the Queen's creature by Littlefinger earlier.
Today he wore white velvet, and his snowy cloak was fastened with a lion brooch. The beast had the soft sheen of gold, and his eyes were tiny rubies.
Of course, she's being misled at every turn here. She's naive and courteous, and they want to keep it that way. So despite all the blood and violence and screams of pain and crying, they tell her that she's being kept safe and that Joffrey would never forgive them if it were otherwise. They essentially ignore her when she asks about Vion Poole and thinks to herself,
she knew there had been fighting, but surely no one would harm a steward.
Okay, sure, Sansa. If that were true, they'd be even less likely to kill a Septa. But, well, And, says to Cersei, I'm good, ask Septa Mordane. She'll tell you. Well, that Septa can't go telling anyone anything. But Sansa doesn't know this yet. Sansa thinks Cersei is gentle and that Joff only kills animals. She's so far blaming all the violence and stuff on other elements, even though she's not entirely clear on who those other elements are. So she's unhappy, but not suffering like Jane is, and is confident everything, at least not to the level Jane is what I mean. She is suffering somewhat. But she's confident everything will be okay soon enough, unlike Jane. Barros takes her to the council chambers past carnage that's being cleaned up, and she's brought into the council chambers. She's blown away by how amazing the room is, particularly the wooden carved screen and the sphinxes. It's a room designed to overawe, and that's what they want to do to her, so it's a well-placed scene. Everyone is wearing black in mourning for the king, but Cersei looks decidedly Targaryen, perhaps meant as an insult to Robert, because, Robert hated the Targaryens.
The queen wore a high-collared black silk gown with 100 dark red rubies sewn into her bodice, covering her from neck to bosom. They were cut in the shape of teardrops, as if the queen were weeping blood. Cersei smiled to see her, and Sansa thought it was the sweetest and saddest smile she had ever seen.
In her next chapter, Sansa's going to see Joff's mourning garb, and like Cersei, it's the same style, basically, Targaryen colors. And at the end of the chapter, with a smile as warm as sunrise, Cersei kisses her gently. So, you've been had, Sansa. She's not sad. She's not sweet either, certainly. She's scared, actually. Even though Robert's death was what she wanted, she has a lot of problems to deal with. Plenty that could go wrong. It's a bit of a tightrope situation. And, well, Cersei doesn't exactly handle it as well as a lot of other people could. But let's jump ahead briefly to Ned's chapter from this episode, which explains why Cersei is worried. Varys, when he's not lying, really explains things quite well, and this is him.
So here is Cersei's nightmare. While her father and brother spend their power battling Starks and Tullys, Lord Stannis will land, proclaim himself king, and lop off her son's curly blonde head. And her own in the bargain, though I truly believe she cares more about the boy.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Not much to add to that. Varys just explains it, lays it out perfectly. And it's nasty. So you see where Cersei's coming from with a lot of this. Now let's move on to what we're calling here a storm of bells.
At sunset on the second day, a great bell began to ring. Its voice was deep and sonorous, and the long, slow clanging filled Sansa with a sense of dread. The ringing went on, and after a while, they heard other bells answering from the great sept of Baelor on Visenya's hill. The sound rumbled across the city like thunder, warning of the storm to come.
As we continue to appreciate the foreshadowing we missed before, one particular impact this time around is that seeing the word bell in the text means so much more than it used to, or at least it has the potential to. It certainly sets off alarm bells. Right. Yeah.
It's warning of the Stormborn to come.
Nice. Considering the Dothraki bells, the Battle of the Bells, Jon Connington, Dany, and how season 8 ended, rather, it makes sense that we're on the lookout, right? And these are the bells of King's Landing that Sansa and Jane are hearing, the same ones featured at the end of season 8.
What is it? Jane asked, covering her ears. Why are they ringing the bells? The king is dead. Sansa could not say how she knew it, yet she did. The slow, endless clanging filled their room, as mournful as a dirge. Had some enemy stormed the castle and murdered King Robert? Was that the meaning of the fighting they had heard?
As mournful as a dirge, indeed. And will those bells ring in the fire? Maybe. Sansa will not likely be here for it, if so. But maybe. Next up, we have It Rhymes with Pain. And yeah, this isn't a fun part.
What shall we do with this little friend of hers, my lords? Lord Peter leaned forward. I'll find a place for her. Not in the city, said the queen. Do you take me for a fool?
Well, he does keep her in the city for quite a while. She doesn't head north until after Jaime makes it all the way back to King's Landing with Brienne, which is after the Red Wedding. Cersei is aware when Jane is sent to the north as fake Arya, but it doesn't seem as if she realizes it's Sansa's friend from this scene. She does know it's some steward's whelp, but it's not clear that she's pieced it all together. Sansa will miss Jane at the end of the chapter and again later, and we wonder if she'll ever learn what's happened to her. She's not in the safest of places right now, sent to the wall by Stannis after she escaped with Theon. Stannis thinks he's sending Arya to Jon, but of course it's Jane. The wall is not so safe, as I said, but it's a huge improvement from where she was, being a captive of Littlefinger or the Boltons. I mean, being captive of both of them at different times, that's rough. But she'll arrive to find Jon Snow stabbed. So she's still, in great peril, it seems like. Nothing seems to go right for her. And she has broken ribs and probably frostbite, and Ramsay's still hunting her. So it's bad. It's a brilliantly dark way to end the chapter, with Sansa realizing she forgot to ask about Arya as she's thinking about Jane, and how she goes right back to reading stories. It's really interesting. She's all throughout the chapter, she's trying to reconcile how these things aren't like songs, how they're not like the stories. And so it's kind of poignant to have her kind of sink back into that. And this is how she kind of gets herself to feel better, how she sort of resets herself. It's centering. And we even get the mentions of what stories she's reading. It's the same familiar ones. Florian and Jonquil and Aemon the Dragon Knight and Nerys. The same character she mentions before. Precisely the same. Different pace and tone from the two previous chapters, setting up the message that Sansa will be staying in King's Landing and is going to be moving from observer to one of two POVs in the city for a while. It's a heavy responsibility, diluting having 3 Stark POVs all down into Sansa's future here. And it's interesting, some of the language here. Sansa and Jane fall asleep holding each other, quote, like sisters. And maybe when they were really young, Arya and Sansa fell asleep like that before they grew apart. It's interesting. Certainly Sansa didn't have another sister to fall asleep like that with. Sansa thinks, like we said, that, or rather the servants not talking to her is something Sir Buckley points out, that's familiar in Ariane's scenes when she's Princess in the Tower down in Dorne. Good catch there. And speaking of armored courtesy, armoring herself in courtesy, a common refrain for Sansa that she's quite good at, Cersei gives a perfect example of how politeness can be a weapon here. And Joe also points out, and what I mean by that, rather, is that Cersei's politeness is arrayed against Sansa, and it totally works, because Sansa mistakes it for politeness, not seeing all the ambition and cruelty and everything else behind it. Barristan is not in that meeting, and that is basically a small council meeting, and that could be a sign that they've already started to not include him in things, knowing that, in just a couple chapters they're about to kick him out. Littlefinger focuses on Hoster instead of Robb, and that's probably his personal bias. He hates Hoster Tully, and of course he hates Ned and Jon Arryn and these other guys, but Robb is just an extension of all that. He's not the direct object of hate. He doesn't really know Robb. And there's just even more and more creepiness from Littlefinger. Not just the stuff with Jane. Of course, that's even worse. But just the fact that he's just staring at Sansa and thinking and talking about how she looks like Catelyn. And yeah, it sticks out even more because we know where it's leading. And, I think it's easy to maybe dismiss it as just, when you see in a story an older guy staring at a young, pretty girl, it's gross, it's creepy, but it's so common too. So maybe it doesn't stand out as much until you know where it's going. And when you know where it's going, it really stands out because, well, there's so much more to think about. So we do hope, like Joe also hopes like we do, or wonders like we do, if Jane and Sansa will be reunited someday. One thing I didn't consider is that not only will she find out what happened to her, but she will be able to tell Sansa all this bad stuff about Littlefinger. Presumably Sansa will have learned a lot of this by herself and will already have plenty of reasons to be against Littlefinger. But it does perhaps add another angle to Littlefinger's eventual fall if we have someone else as a witness to all the bad things he's done. I did not really consider Jane surviving long enough to be part of Littlefinger's downfall. And that is, well, if she does survive, and I hope she does, that would be a nice thing for her to help out with to get a little measure of justice. A few random things here. The servants fled from her as if she had, quote, the Grey Plague. And that's the first ever time the Grey Plague is mentioned. And the Grey Plague, of course, is a nastier version of grayscale. They're cousins, I suppose you could say, cousin diseases. Here's a little quote.
She warmed the pale white beeswax over a candle, pouring it carefully, and watched as the eunuch stamped each letter with the direwolf of House Stark.
So Varys has the House Stark stamp, that's might matter. He probably got it from Vian Poole. The steward was probably the one in possession of it, which is kind of an ominous little piece of data here. We already probably assumed Van Poole was dead at this point, but this almost certainly seals the deal there. Mehrab Greywall from Facebook wonders about Mandon Moore's curiously dead eyes because it's mentioned a couple times. Yeah, I wonder about that too. I wonder if George didn't have originally different plans for him. The fact that all he does is eventually turn on Tyrion and then die by Podrick means that, they didn't really dig into his personality too much, other than him being, a vessel for assassination, proving that he was never really deserving to be a Kingsguard in the first place. But I don't have a bigger answer than that. I wonder if there's more to it. In reference to Littlefinger's creepiness towards Sansa, we find out it's later, much later, through Cersei, that Littlefinger asked to marry Sansa. And we don't know when that was, but it might have been here. This might have been around that time because they're trying to figure out what to do with Sansa. They know that she's not going to marry Joffrey anymore, or they're at least considering that. They're very close to that decision if they haven't made it already. And maybe Littlefinger thought that, doing this betrayal, hooking Cersei and Joffrey up with the gold cloaks, turning on Ned, maybe he thought that would be his reward. Of course, it wasn't. Cersei rebuffs him and says he's too lowborn for that. And of course, that's what he's been hearing. That's what motivates Littlefinger. Telling him he's not good enough has been a big part of his whole life. And then he goes out and arranges the marriage between the Tyrells and the Lannisters and tells Cersei and the council that, hey, they're not going to let me be this agent of the crown. They're not going to take me seriously unless you make me a lord too. And then all of a sudden he is good enough. And there you go. That's Littlefinger in a nutshell right there. On the other hand, Robb, when he gets this letter, meaning the letter they force Sansa to write here, she writes 4 letters, and Robb is one of the recipients. He's going to curse about the lack of news of Arya and asks what's wrong with her. Now, first of all, Robb is young and naive, less so than Sansa maybe, but he doesn't realize what Catelyn realizes right away, which is, oh, come on, this is not Sansa's words. This is Cersei making Sansa write this. And of course she's right. She realizes that right away. And that's kind of maybe a sign of Robb's naivety in politics. Obviously, he is very talented in war and other things with tactics and bravery, but this, of course, his downfall is mismanaging politics, and this is perhaps a little sign of that. Bran, of course, blurts out that Sansa lost her wolf, as if that's the key part here, and that is... yeah, that hurts, and it might be accurate. But as we know, Sansa's going to probably circle back around and get back to Winterfell, and she still does pray to the old gods and things like that. So she's not totally detached in her mind, but she is detached in terms of, well, she's a hostage now, and her family is not around her. Nina Friel wonders if Cersei is thinking here about the younger, more beautiful queen part of the prophecy, if she's already paranoid about who that might be, if she's, thinking maybe it's Sansa. Sansa, when the idea for Sansa to marry Joffrey was first proposed by Robert, you wonder if that immediately set off those alarm bells in Cersei. And of course, Dany is the more likely person that the prophecy is pointing to. And Cersei may or may not have considered Dany. She's certainly aware of Dany. She's not on the small council yet, although she will be by the end of this episode. And so she wasn't there for all these discussions of taking out Dany. But she's surely aware that this Targ princess is out there because Viserys and Daenerys escaping was pretty common knowledge. So she's got to know. All right, that's it for Sansa 4. Let's go to Jon 7, the one where Jon saves Mormont, a.k.a. the gang fights dead rangers, also known as the one where Jon tries to stab Sir Alliser. This chapter really stands out as one that would fit in quite well as a horror story, and it almost fits as a standalone. I was considering just thinking about that. There's a couple of things you'd have to take out because they're referencing other plot lines that don't really matter or wouldn't be relevant if it was a standalone, but it does work pretty well as a standalone from where I can tell. A lot of other people notice this theme too. The horror theme is really prominent. George is a really good horror writer, and he doesn't put a lot of horror into Song of Ice and Fire, considering how large the series is. But when he does it, it's really good. Of course, the prologue was probably the last time we had anything like this. And there's definitely, obviously, there's more to come. There's going to be more examples like this. But he's just getting started in book 1 here. So he is, Jon is now the Lord Commander's steward. And we see that this day is unusually warm, which matters quite a lot since the lack of rot and maggots and such are disturbing and confusing. If it had been really cold, well, they might not be wondering why there's no maggots and rotting. So that's really important for this moment.
Other, announced Sir Jeremy Riker, beyond a doubt, and this one was Jafer Flowers. He turned the corpse over with his foot, and the dead white face stared up at the overcast sky with blue, blue eyes. They were Ben Stark's men, both of them.
Blue eyes. That emphasis really stands out the second time through if it didn't the first time. Jafer's hand was the one Ghost brought to them. And if you think about it, I suppose the way that went was Ghost smelled the bodies, then saw them after, sniffing down the scent, following the trail of the scent, rather. Then ripped off a hand to go bring it to Jon. I guess that's what happened. That's maybe Ghost was guided a little by you-know-who. Name rhymes with Flood Maven. This hand is the same hand that Alliser Thorne takes to Tyrion, who is acting hand at the time. But Tyrion doesn't like Alliser, which that's just crazy because everyone loves Sir Alliser Thorne. They almost named that show Everyone Loves Raymond, Everyone Loves Sir Alliser Thorne. It's the first time anyone's ever disliked him, really. This is really amazing. And of course, Tyrion, as we know, he makes Alliser wait. That's what he does because he doesn't like him. He's like, I'm going to make that dude wait. And during that waiting period, the hand rots away. So it's kind of a minor tragic irony that these two people hating each other caused this possible piece of evidence that could have really stirred people to action, just was completely wasted opportunity. Jon immediately realizes what a green boy he was in pleading to go with Benjen. He sees these dead men and realizes, well, these experienced rangers were killed. What would happen to me? And the discussion turns to the details here. At first, Mormont is angry that they were killed so close to the wall without anyone knowing about it, especially the fact that Othor carries a horn here. Sir Jeremy Riker is the main voice arguing against magic and the undead here. He argues it was wildlings. It's kind of like Ned Stark being like, well, what else could it be? How could it be the undead? That doesn't make any sense. There's no undead. But he seems to change his tune as Sam's arguments roll out, and he semi-convinces himself when Tywin points out that Othor didn't have blue eyes, and he blurts out, neither did Jafer. And everyone's just freaked out at that point. That's part of what we're talking about when saying it's a really amazing piece of horror writing here. However, said details, aka dead details, reveal that they were not killed here. Rather, they were likely left here, intended to be found, intended to be taken inside for closer inspection, perhaps? Because of the odd details? Too curious to just discard? Maybe that was what the others were thinking from their point of view. The Night's Watch will be spooked, but also curious, and will want to examine these bodies. And that's exactly what they want. It plays into their hands. Certainly worked if that was the plan. So what actually happened to Benjen and his men? Well, there's still some details we're not privy to. Hopefully we'll find out later. But it seems like Benjen's party was taken. The others must have been there because, well, there was raising of the dead. And it wasn't just an encounter with whites. And we know that because it looks like Jafer appears to have killed Othor. Or rather, other way around. Othor killed Jafer because Jafer was killed by an axe. And Othor did have an axe. But the axe wasn't present there, which is more evidence that the killing happened elsewhere and the bodies were just left there. But again, no sign of Benjen, no evidence of what would have happened to him. So was he saved by the children, as is depicted in the show, or is he captured by the others, which has been a long-term theory that the others wanted his blood, or that the fact that having a Stark is important to them? Lots of theories still abound, and most of them are still on the table because the show didn't really tackle that with much depth. This next part I've called the dead now, the dead later. As he's staring down at what we know are whites, well, it takes Jon to a dream of the dead rising in the crypts of Winterfell.
Last night he had dreamt the Winterfell dream again. He was wandering the empty castle, searching for his father, descending into the crypts. Only this time, the dream had gone further than before. In the dark, he'd heard the scrape of stone on stone. When he turned, he saw that the vaults were opening, one after the other. As the dead kings came stumbling from their cold, black graves, Jon had woken in pitch dark, his heart hammering. Even when Ghost leapt up on the bed to nuzzle at his face, he could not shake his deep sense of terror.
Again, Ghost is Jon's, refuge, his safety, and that, of course, is building up to maybe when Jon dies, his spirit going into Ghost. Note how it also says that Jon was searching for his father descending into the crypts. Is this a reference to Rhaegar or Ned? It's not clear. It's kind of metaphorical. We don't see the father he's looking for. Of course, down in the crypts of Winterfell, he's not going to find Rhaegar. He's not going to find Ned either, though he will soon. And Rickon and Bran will have their own dreams of Ned's death soon. Of course, there might be clues to his parentage down in the crypts. It just won't be his father. And Rhaegar has been dead for a while. So, I don't know. I'm not sure which is being referred to here, whether it's Rhaegar or Ned. When he says father, Jon doesn't find them in either case. And as for the dead rising, that seems to be the more prominent part of this. Mormont does order a more thorough search of the area. And, well, that falls to First Ranger Sir Jeremy Riker here. Sir Jeremy, however, is killed by the Jafer Flowers White, along with several other men. But first, Robert, the man who killed Jon's father, is dead, and that news reaches the wall.
The things we love destroy us every time, lad. Remember that. My son loved that young wife of his, vain woman. If not for her, he would never have thought to sell those poachers.
Of course, he's referring to the fact that Robert was killed while hunting, and Robert loved hunting. But of course, Gior is being a little bit of a homer here, favoring his son, blaming the expensive taste of his wife and not his slaving son. Anyway, the larger point is the major concern here, love versus duty. It's a recurring major theme in the series, especially at the Wall. And this conversation he's going to soon have with Maester Aemon in the next episode. And with regard to the Kingsguard as well, which are going to come up big in this episode and later. And in cases like Dany going with her perceived duty to, say, marry Hisdar versus her love for, say, Dario. And when Jon considers the idea of Ned Stark on the Wall, which Ned Stark will consider himself a bit later, he shows that his read on Joffrey was very perceptive. Jon, that is.
And would Joffrey allow it? He remembered the prince at Winterfell, the way he mocked Robb and Ser Roderick in the yard. Jon himself he had scarcely even noticed. Bastards were beneath even his contempt.
There's that bastard irony with Jon and Joffrey yet again coming up. And of course, what he's saying is, would Joffrey allow Ned Stark to take the Black? The answer is no, at least not if he's getting advice from Littlefinger. So Jon's temper gets the best of him when he hears Sir Alliser call his father a traitor. Jon losing his temper is something that happens a few times. It's very interesting. It's maybe meant to point to his Targaryen fire in his blood, but really Rhaegar was a calm kind of guy. And Brandon, Ned's older brother, was the one that this seems most like. But Lyanna had it too. So really this is Lyanna that he's channeling, probably most of all. Now, of course, Sir Alliser has long felt that Ned Stark was a traitor. It's not just because of Jon and not just because of what's just happened with Ned and his handship. It's because Ned was a key leader in overthrowing Aerys, and Sir Alliser was loyal to Aerys. So this must all seem like karma to Sir Alliser. Jon's friends save him twice. Here, they stop him from harming Alliser, and later they bring him back from trying to desert. So, a good job picking your friends well, Jon. Some notable moments from the action here. It's interesting that the Whites can be stealthy. The guard outside Jon's door was killed without waking Jon, and there doesn't seem to be a struggle. The man never even drew his sword, and we know that because Jon draws his sword for him when he's coming out of his room finding this dead man. He's like, well, I better arm myself. He obviously doesn't have Longclaw yet. We learn a few other things about the Whites here too, things that might help us understand some things later when the number of Whites in the story grows dramatically and we see them more often and we get more data on how they operate. I'm not sure the great strength that Othor is showing off here is entirely a product of magic, though it probably helps. But Othor was a large man, so he was probably pretty strong already, and that might carry over. The two dead Rangers certainly seem to have memories that were useful to the others, as one went for the first Ranger and the other for the Lord Commander. That's very precise. There's no way that was random. I mean, you target the two top officers in the entire Night's Watch. Interesting that they didn't target Maester Aemon, but anyway. Jon thinks the same thing, though, that it was Jon wonders, too, about this targeting.
Can they talk? Asked Jon Snow. I think not, but I cannot claim to know. Monsters they may be, but they were men before they died. How much remains? The one I slew was intent on killing Lord Commander Mormont. Plainly, it remembered who he was and where to find him.
It's interesting, too, that he uses the term monster, because Cold Hands says, I'm your monster, Brandon Stark. There are a lot of places Bloodraven might have taken control of an animal in the series. There's just so many. And when we did our Bloodraven episode, we focused on a few examples rather than just trying to pick every possible example out, because really it would take so long to do that. So we just focused on the most compelling ones. And of course, some examples, the Mother Direwolf is one, Balerion the cat, perhaps. Certainly Mormont's Raven. That's one of the most blatant, perhaps the most blatant. And unprompted, it does this, as Jon and Ghost are struggling to deal with the Othor White.
Staggering to his feet, he kicked the arm away and snatched the lamp from the old bear's fingers. The flame flickered and almost died. Burn, the Raven cawed. Burn, burn, burn.
Just to be sure, I checked to see if the Raven ever yells burn again. He does not. This is the only time. So far, maybe it'll happen again. He does say corn quite a lot more, though. Yeah. So the animals, too. Interesting to think about the animals, how the dogs and insects and other animals apparently stay away from the Whites, but not Ghost. He's happy to go right up and start munching. What does that mean? And this sets clues for Chet's prologue later in A Storm of Swords, or later in the beginning of A Storm of Swords, with the dogs not taking the scent there either. Joe Buckley points out that this line that Gior says, I knew some of the king's counselors in my youth, Old Pycelle, Lord Stannis, Sir Barristan. Interesting. Did Gior also journey south to fight in the rebellion? We don't know. I don't think he would have been, or he would have taken the Black by the time of Balon's rebellion, I believe, but he might have fought in Robert's rebellion. That's interesting. And if not that, then maybe he had a reason to go to court prior to the rebellion. Joe points out something that none of us needed to remember, but it's funny to remember that when Jon is struggling with Othor, the White shoves his fingers in his mouth, and it's just, what a gory, gross detail. It just adds to the horror of the scene. It's like, ugh. It's not bloody. It's not like, it doesn't seem dangerous. It's just really gross. And just, if you think about that happening to you, it's just the kind of, you think of danger and suffering and pain in situations like that, and being in danger and being in danger of being killed, not being the taste of dead person's hand in your mouth. It's just a new way to make the scene more gross. Very creative, George, in a dark way. Noga Frankel from Facebook points out that Sam saved Alistair Thorne. Good point. Yeah, he really did. He's the one that gets in the way first of Jon sticking his dagger in Alistair Thorne's face. And that is kind of ironic, because Alistair Thorne was really horrible to Sam. But of course, Sam is saving Jon, not Alistair. It's funny to think of it this way, and it is true. Also, Noga wonders about them letting Jon keep Ghost in his room when he's basically in prison under house arrest. And that's probably just because, well, what else are they going to do with Ghost, right? Everybody's kind of afraid of Ghost, and they don't want to. Jon's the only one that keeps him calm, and yeah, he's intimidating. Just let the wolf stay in there where no one else is gonna be harmed or scared by him. earlier in the book, Robert ordered Ned to drink with him, and here we have Mormont doing that to Jon. And later, Cersei's going to order Sansa to drink with her during the Battle of the Blackwater. That's much later in the Clash of Kings. And,
that's a lot of, I wouldn't call it peer pressure. I would call it,
adults
power,
forcing
right? Yeah.
teenagers to drink.
Yeah.
Well, not Ned, but still. I love it. Speaking of drinking, the phrase pale as milk is used a few times here. Both Sam turning pale as milk and the dead bodies. I don't think that's a reference to like Sam dying, but I do think it shows you that maybe there's a the pale as milk, you go, it's like a fear thing, and the whites are so scary that they turn you as white as they are as they're scaring you, and yeah, and then they turn you into one of them. You're already the right color when they kill you.
Well, what kind of milk?
Whole milk? Skim milk? No, whole milk, right? 2%. 2% milk. So, of course, the black hands are a big part of this as well. We talked about cold hands a bit, and the description of the blood pooling up at their hands. And, well, that'll probably come up again. Whole armies of whites looking like that. The show didn't give them that detail, but I forgive them for that. That would be a lot of extra costuming, making all the whites' hands black. Yeah. Don't mind that too much. Okay, Bran 6. Usually, as I say, I try to pick out which chapter I think is maybe the most important. And, the first time through, on a first-time read, it's probably the Ned chapter. But for a reread, I think it's this one. There's so much going on. I'm just blown away by how much happens in Bran chapters. You just have almost every plot line that we've gotten up to so far referred to. You've got old god stuff. You've got the war. You got Osha, you've got all this, you get news from the south, you have Lady's bones arriving, you have Rickon's wildness, you have so much sadness, you have, and since this is a reread, we see all these Northern Lords and know that so many of them are going to die. We know that Lord Karstark is going to betray Robb, and that Robb and Bran won't see each other again. It's just really sad. It's the one where Greatjon drops 2 digits, aka the gang calls the banners. It's also, you could call it the one where Robb rides the wrong way, the one where Bran becomes the Stark in Winterfell, the one where he gets to know Osha and the old gods, the one where he thinks of himself as Bran the Broken for the first time.
I think one of the best titles so far is the one where Robb rides the wrong way. It's just fun to say.
Robb rides the wrong way. You're right. It really is alliterative, isn't it?
Yeah. The one where Robb rides the wrong way. You need the where.
The one where Robb rides the wrong way. Yeah, you're right. That's really good. Say that 10 times fast. And we also see that Bran has begun riding Hodor's back in a basket. Speaking of riding, and he's riding the right way. He's getting used to people, dealing with people mocking him.
The Karstarks came in on a cold, windy morning, bringing 300 horsemen and near 2,000 foot from their castle at Carhold.
It's some of these men who laugh at him and Hodor, but a moment later he calls Summer over to himself, and the horses get a scare, and a lot of the men riding them are like, "Whoa!" And I wonder if Bran was kind of like getting them back a little bit for that. Much later, when the Karstarks split from the Starks, some of these men will be among those hunting the man who crippled the boy they're now laughing at. If that didn't make sense, well, remember that the Karstark are going to abandon Robb and go hunt Jaime in the Riverlands because Lord Karstark gave a big reward for anyone who got Jaime, and that is the hand of his daughter. And so these Karstark brothers, a little while later in the chapter, Bran overhears them describing him as broken inside as well as out. It goes too far. That really upsets him, and that's when he thinks of himself as Bran the Broken. And it's so very similar to what Jaime says about wanting a clean death to Tyrion. A very similar sentiment. Now, 2 of these Karstark brothers, the 2 young ones, the very ones who insult Bran here, will die defending Robb against Jaime at the Whispering Wood. And it's their deaths that spur Lord Karstark's murder of the Lannister boys. So there's a lot of little seeds in this moment that grow to be huge, deadly trees. I don't know, poison ivy. The older brother is also here, meaning the older brother of Karstark. Now, he doesn't say anything bad about Bran, from what we can tell. It's his younger brothers that do. He seems to be polite. He is last seen as a captive at Maidenpool. And he may have, however, been given over to the crown. More on that in a minute, because a certain other character introduced here is also possibly given over to the crown in a prisoner transfer. There's some additional important description of Winterfell itself here. We already knew about the cold pool by the Heart Tree. Now we're told that there are precisely 3 hot pools fed by the underground hot springs in the general area that Hodor goes and has a nice long bath in. Bran thinks about how much Hodor loves those baths. Bran himself likes the Godswood.
But does he also think about the D?
Does he?
HBO did.
HBO really did. They had Osha give that one a wink. Not his real member, apparently. That was a stunt wang.
Yeah, it was not. It was definitely not.
How about that? Stunt wangs. That's a thing. Stunt butts are a thing. Why not stunt wangs? Yeah, stunt breasts. Oh, every part of the body has a stunt version out there. So yeah, Bran does like the Godswood and thinks about how the Heart Tree doesn't scare him anymore. So clearly it used to kind of scare him. In addition to getting used to what people are saying about him, he's getting used to the Heart Tree. So it's kind of like he's becoming Bran, the Bran that we know more now. This is kind of part of that transformation. He's comforted at the thought of the old gods watching over him instead of it being scary. So, and of course it's accurate, the thought, meaning that they're watching over him. They really are watching. Bloodraven tells him when he gets to his cave, "I've been watching you since your birth." He's like, yeah, that's a long ass time, man. And this is what, here's a little quote.
Tell me what you meant about hearing the gods. Osha studied him. You ask them and they're answering. Open your ears, listen. You'll hear. Bran listened. It's only the wind, he said after a moment, uncertain. The leaves are rustling.
Rustling. Oh boy. So on an episode we did a long time back, well, that is the language used by George R. R. Martin. The old gods, the speech of the werewoods, rustling. That phrase, that word is so crucial here. And Osha flat out says it.
We hear you. They hear you talking. That rustling, that's them talking back.
We go into great detail on this pattern in our werewood episodes. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. We've done that already, but it's a really big deal. It is the key to knowing when the old gods are speaking, or when Bran is speaking through the Heart Tree. It happens when Theon is looking at the Heart Tree and Bran is perhaps reaching out to him. So definitely key in on that. This is not a lightly used word. Rustle of the leaves. Russell of the Leaves. That sounds like some dude. Sir Russell of the Leaves.
It does.
Listen for him. Yeah. So Osha also gives us more, though. It's not just about the werewoods and the old gods. She talks about giants and even goes so far as to describe half human, half giants. And she's inspired by seeing Hodor, which is pretty cool. This also references the TV show scene. It's not just his body, but his member that inspires her thoughts here. And Lewin thinks
it also makes you think of Tormund.
It does, you're right. That's very true, very true. Lewin thinks all of these are wild tales and brushes off the idea that the children can teach Bran magic. Well, he's wrong about that one. Osha's got this one right for sure. And a different kind of wild tale is being told about what's happened to Ned. Rather many such tales. A common refrain for the series is that by the time news reaches other ears, it's the game of telephone has happened. There's, it's been exaggerated. There's different versions of the rumor because they've gone through different channels to get there, and each channel has its own quirks in who told the story and who retold the story and who exaggerated and how. And, well, here's a passage with an interesting choice of words that leads us on into another plot line that's happening.
Only 2 days ago, one of Lord Bolton's men knifed one of Lord Kerwin's at the smoking log. Our Lady Mother would skin me for a pelt if I let you put yourself at risk. Now,
that is quite a pair of sentences. There's so much packed into that. Lord Medgar Kerwin is going to die in the south, and his son Clay will inherit, only to die to Ramsay's duplicity during the taking of Winterfell. Lord Medgar's daughter Janelle is now the Lady of Castle Kerwin, which is only a half day's ride from Winterfell. It's very close by. Of course, Rob talking about skinning and pelts is on point here, describing the later Bolton betrayal of House Stark, and a pivotal moment symbolizing that future betrayal, or that pending betrayal, is when Roose goes out to hunt wolves when he's at Harrenhal, killing many and using them for pelts and gloves. So perhaps it's no coincidence that this is the chapter where we first learn of the Dreadfort's skin room. Rob mentions it. And it's like, what? They have what? A room of skins? Wow. Rickon's wildness here is very interesting to consider. He's quite out of control. He punched old Nan. Wow. It's not just, a kid kind of acting out. It's worse than that. I mean, Shaggy, channeling Rickon's wildness, he bites a chunk of flesh from Micken's thigh. That's a bad dog. And but poor kid, because that's coming from Rickon's lack of parenting and confusion and frustrations and suffering. But that kind of wildness can come in large adult form too, like Tyrion's Vale clansmen, who we'll get later in this episode. And now, right here, we get Greatjon. Something tells me Greatjon would love fierce little Rickon, and it's funny to think that, in the show, the way the things go with the Umbers and Rickon is, well, it's sad, but it could have, you wish that this could have happened, and hey, I guess there's a small chance it could, because, well, we're going to talk about it in a minute. Greatjon's still alive in the books, and both of them, Greatjon and Rickon, have a little something in common here. They both brandish a sword within a few paragraphs. Rickon does his down in the crypts when they're looking for him and he's hiding down there. And Greatjon, of course, does it more famously, drawing his sword and, Grey Wind bites his fingers. So he's kind of a strange character, Greatjon, from a meta perspective, that is. The actor left the show after season 2, so any chance that HBO would have revealed the book version of his fate left with him. He was captured during the Red Wedding, not killed. Jaime Lannister ordered the Freys to give him up to the crown, but we don't know if that's actually happened. Walder Frey may have just disobeyed, or maybe he's being the late Lord Frey, delaying that for a while. And we see what Small John Umber does on the TV show, and, well, Small John Umber in the books is killed during the Red Wedding, so it's in the books, it's Greatjon's uncles who are active now. On TV, Small John Umber just says, my father died, without any explanation of how, and it's pretty clear that they just did that because the actor left the show. So, let's talk about the uncles just for a second. One of them is Mors, a.k.a. Crowfood. He grabs Theon and Jane after they jump and deliver them to Stannis. He's clearly not working for Roose Bolton. He also digs pit traps that kills Aenys Frey right outside Winterfell. The other uncle is Hother, a.k.a. Horsebane, who bends the knee to Roose, but does it under duress and shows many signs of wanting to fight the Boltons if the chance comes. So maybe he seems to be biding his time. And some evidence of this is that Mors wants Stannis to forgive Horsebane, which is kind of an evidence that this was a plan all along. Also, though, it's confusing because Book Greatjon has other sons. It's not just Small John. Though they might be on the younger side, we don't really know. And it's even more confusing because the Small John also has sons. So there's basically a lot of untapped Umbers in the story. And though they lose a lot of soldiers at the Red Wedding, only one actual Umber dies there, Small John, and none elsewhere. So there's a lot of Umbers left just out there. And so, well, we'll have to wait and see.
Hodor, Bran agreed, wondering what it meant.
Yeah, and that's the way the chapter ends. And of course, we know what it means, but what a line to have here in a chapter packed full of so many different plot lines. We get reference to one that we didn't even know was a plot line at the time. I mean, we didn't think, even back then, I never thought Hodor's name would... I mean, we knew that he had a different name than Hodor. It was probably Walder, right? But the idea that there would be a big reveal in addition to him having a different name, I don't think that, probably not even one fan in 1,000 was sniffed out that one. So this line is just really jumps out this time around, like so many others do, but this one in particular. Joe Buckley points out that the imprisonment of Ned surely hurried the marches of the Northern Lords. We shouldn't pretend they haven't also come to see what they can get out of the new young wolf. As you can see from Greatjon and Roose Bolton and Lord Hornwood, they test him in a variety of ways, usually trying to get something out of him. Different things they want to get out of him, whether it's land, regard, command positions. It's different. But you can see that they all want something. Maybe in some ways they're a little more blunt about it, but in other ways they're just as sneaky as the Southerners by hiding what they're really wanting, by disguising their ambition, by pretending to be nice when really it's just something for their benefit. Wyman Manderly is going to be doing quite a lot of this later. And you get a varying range here of loyalty versus ambition. All these lords have some level of loyalty and some level of ambition, and sometimes those things are completely opposed, like in the case of Roose Bolton, and sometimes they're very well lined up. In other words, Roose Bolton's ambition turns him against the Starks, though it didn't have to go that way. But with the Manderleys, his ambition is framed with loyalty to the Starks. He is very ambitious, but turning on the Starks isn't an option. He still is ambitious within that, set of rules, you could call it, within his honor. So that's I like seeing that here. We some of us think that maybe the North is less political, and maybe it is. It's just but I think maybe it's more accurate to say differently political. Not more or less, just different. The culture is different. The weather is different. The trends are different. The backgrounds are different. The traditions are different. Lots of things are different. But people are still ambitious. People are still cruel. People are still power hungry. People are still have blood debts and vendettas, things like that. Joe also points out that Greatjon loses some fingers, but rises to be a right-hand man, kind of like Davos. Good catch. There's a lot of hands and hand kind of things going on in this series. There's a lot of hand injuries and people who might be hand or who are right-hand mans having things go wrong with their hand. John Connington's another one. He's obviously Aegon the Sixth, Young Griff's right-hand man, and his I think it's his left hand though that gets grayscale, but still similar enough. And we have more about Connington later in this episode too. He's going to come back up. So, referring to Robb marching the wrong way, Joe points out that it's a really good placement to have that message immediately following Jon's chapter, which backs up Osha's argument that they're marching the wrong way. It's not just, oh yeah, we saw that happen in the prologue, so yeah, it makes sense that they're marching the wrong way. It's apparent immediately. Very good. In other words, the chapter ordering is really done well here. And a couple of questions and comments from y'all. Mostly, a couple of people pointed out that Kat makes the same argument, or at least thinks in her head the same thing that Bran and Lewin both say here, which is Robb doesn't have to lead the Northern host himself. Interesting. Robb disagrees, clearly. And Robb was right. If we're being honest, maybe Robb should have had someone else managing the politics for him. But as far as leading the battles, him and Blackfish and whatever else advice he was getting from others, that I don't think anyone else could have done that better. So Robb knew better than they did, but at least on that regard. A couple people pointed out as well that the Manderly footmen have tridents, which is really cool. They have fancier spears, basically. The tridents would almost certainly cost a lot more to make than spears, but the Manderlys can afford it. I wonder how practical they are in battle. I've never really seen trident, like a whole squadron, let alone a whole 1,500 men or whatever it was with tridents. I wonder how that would work. I'm very curious. I wonder if anyone has thoughts on that. I don't know that there's any real-world analog for actual armies armed with tridents.
Aquaman and his men.
Oh, of course. I didn't think of that real-world example.
Yeah.
Aqua Drogo.
Yeah.
Kalara from patron Kalara talks about Bran describing the Godswood as becoming to him, quote, an island of peace in the sea of chaos that Winterfell had become. To her, that makes her think of season 8, episode 3, with Bran waiting in the Godswood as, bait. And it's kind of an island of temporary peace amidst battle. She wonders if she's stretching this too far, or could this suggest a similar showdown in the books? Well, I don't know that there'll be a similar showdown with Bran in the Godswood there at Winterfell. It could be, but of course the lack of a Night King makes this a little bit more difficult. But this line does say something else to me that's interesting, and it might relate kind of an oblique way to what Kilara is saying here. because the Island of Peace and the Sea of Chaos, to me, that sounds like the Isle of Faces, this sort of untouched thing directly in the center of Westeros, and it's literally an island. And Westeros itself is this, you could call it a Sea of Chaos because of all the humanity and the Game of Thrones being played generation to generation, so many wars being fought. Meanwhile, the Isle of Faces just sits there and no one goes there, and it just kind of remains the way it's always been. I mean, I guess so. I don't know what's really, maybe for all we know, they're partying on there and constantly doing stuff. But that's really interesting because, touching back on season 8, episode 3, as Kilara points out, a lot of us at the time seeing that episode wondered if what Winterfell might fall with Stannis running it. And the great battle that humanity will face the others in will be at Harrenhal. And there's a lot of reasons to think it would happen there instead. One of them being Dany sees herself in a vision melting an army of ice at the Trident. For another reason, Harrenhal just has all this foreshadowing for fitting so many people in it at once. It just is this wonderful place for, it's set up so well for a last stand, for fitting so many different types of armies in it. And it happens to be right by the Isle of Faces, which has a lot of foreshadowing for being important in ways that we aren't quite clear on. So I think that's a great comment by Kilara, because it touches on a lot of these elements that are far off in the future that are probably being referenced here. And the reason they're maybe a little more vague is George probably hadn't worked all of it quite out yet, but he knew some of these important pieces enough to hint us in the right direction. So I think that's very important. Speaking of the Isle of Faces, it's the name of Sir Buckley's podcast. Check it out. They do Scraps and Scrolls, which is sort of the expansion of things we talked about during each episode of Valar Rereadis. Let us move on to Daenerys VI, the one with the poison wine cellar, a.k.a. the Khal promises to lead the gang to Westeros. The one where Drogo hunts the Hrakkar. The one where Dany puts her eggs in the fire the first time.
When he had taken his pleasure, Khal Drogo rose from their sleeping mats to tower over her.
The Khal says Rhaego has no need of an iron chair and speaks of plundering the lands around the Jade Sea. That's beyond the Bone Mountains, certainly farther than I'd expect a Khalasar to travel. But in the same passage, Dany thinks of how the Khal is bolder than other Dothraki in 100 ways. So, well, there you go. It would make sense that someone bolder than other Dothraki would want to go farther. And of course, that might be why Illyrio and Varys picked this guy in the first place, because of that boldness. They need someone who would be willing to cross the poison water that no Dothraki has ever done. But all that is also kind of George being sneaky.
I mean, did they really want them to actually cross, though?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think they wanted to save the realm, like they're going to have Fagon be the hero and save the realm
save
and all
it
that.
from her, yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of different people that he could potentially be saving people from.
That's true.
I guess they just hedged their bet. Anyways, whatever.
Yeah. It's certainly not a sure thing, but I do believe that's accurate. And this is also screening an even bigger surprise, which is not a surprise to us, but at the time, Drogo's death, pretty powerful, pretty surprising, not expected by a lot of people. I remember having my friend Joe, reading this book for the first time back in, I think, 2002 or 3 or 4, and him saying to me, I can't wait for Khal Drogo to go over to Westeros and kick all this ass. And I'm like, man, you might not want to get attached to any particular character here. So it was surprising, and especially because Ned's death is going to come so close to Drogo's, and, well, that there's several surprises built in there. It's just like one surprise after another. Now, speaking of building up to something, here's a pretty big line from Dany.
She wondered if the gods of burned cities could still answer prayers.
Whoa, the gods of burned cities. Heyo. That's a big one. That's a real big one. That's a line that I didn't think much of any of the first 10, 12, 15 times I read it. But this time, hey, that matters. Speaking of things that weren't in the show, or that referenced the show, or that we wanted to have in the show, the Dothraki markets, great example of world building that the show didn't really have. Its greater depth of Dothraki culture featured in the books. The wine cellar's poison aside, he mentions his other wines from Tyrosh, Lys, Myr, Andalos, Volantis, Dorne, and the Arbor. There's also perfumes from Lys, which is reflecting its position as a city of pleasure and leisure. We get to poisoners from Lys. He is himself from Lys, this poisoner, which is maybe easy to miss because in the show he's portrayed like a lot of people as a, brown-haired, brown-eyed guy. He doesn't have the look of a Lysene, but in the books here he's blonde. He does look like a Lyseni. We also see in the market a woman selling Lannisport goldwork, which shows just not only how important the goldwork of Lannisport is, but the fact that it is reached all the way out here to the Dothraki market. It's just really neat to show the great variety that's here. We also have a Yeti cloth trader haggling over green dye that I would guess came from Tyrosh, and he's wearing a monkey-tailed hat. And that monkey-tailed hat is, well, that's a reference to Azor Ahai of all things. Here we go.
It is also written that there are annals in Ashai of such a darkness, and of a hero who fought against it with a red sword. His deeds are said to have been performed before the rise of Valyria in the earliest age when Old Gis was still forming its empire. This legend has spread west from Ashai, and the followers of R'hllor claim that this hero was named Azor Ahai, and prophesy his return. In the Jade Compendium, Kulakwo Votar recounts a curious legend from Yeti, which states that the sun hid its face from the earth for a lifetime, ashamed at something none could discover, and that disaster was averted only by the deeds of a woman with a monkey's tail.
Oh, there you go, the monkey's tail. So the Yetish still wear those monkey-tailed hats in honor of this woman, whoever she was. So that's very cool, very obscure reference that is sort of, the circle is maybe not completed, but it added to in the world of Ice and Fire. Very cool. That caravans are allowed to travel from far and wide unharmed shows that the Dothraki are not purely warlike savages, which is something that is kind of the impression we're given in a lot of places. Now, there's probably the occasional Khal who breaks this pact and attacks caravans, but likely enough, other Khals would come for such a person. And she thinks on how they don't understand buying and selling, yet they host these extremely diverse and peaceful markets. That's what's really interesting. Though perhaps this chapter, the one with an attempted assassination on her, is not maybe the best example of showing a peaceful market. But Varys and Illyrio had to accelerate their plan, as the talk that Arya overheard shows, and so I'm calling this next part Accelerating the Plan.
A great caravan arrived during the night, Khaleesi. 400 horses from Pentos by way of Norvos and Qohor, under the command of merchant captain Bian Votiris. Illyrio may have sent a letter. Would you care to visit the Western Market?
My thinking here is Illyrio definitely sent a letter, but he may have sent this whole caravan. It's a merchant captain Bian Votiris is Pentoshi apparently, and this caravan came from Pentos, where Illyrio has enormous power. That's Illyrio's hood, Pentos. Jorah knows this caravan might have a letter from Illyrio, and of course there's a connection between Jorah and Illyrio and Varys, as we well know. Now, after the incident, Votiris arrives, and look at this quote.
He seemed to know what had happened without a word being spoken.
What happens is Dany says to the wine seller that she and Drogo will share the wine together. Now, that's how the wine seller expects to get away with it, because obviously if she drinks it right there and dies, then he's toast too. But if she takes the wine back, Drogo and Dany drink it together, they both die, then he has a chance to collect his reward. But of course, killing Drogo would have messed up the plan big time. They wanted the Khal to invade, as we discussed earlier, and Jorah's interference is key in making sure the plan proceeds properly. Jorah shows Dany a letter revealing that a lordship is offered for Dany's death by Robert Baratheon. Of course, at this point, they don't know that Robert is now actually dead. Dany laughs without humor at how they don't know Viserys is dead. So, news travels slowly. They're really far apart. Vaes Dothrak is quite far from King's Landing. Now, Robert, of course, never had any control over the details of the plan to kill her and or Viserys. He just said he wanted it done. Just get it done. And so Varys had control of that, as we know. And of course, with Varys' hand on the scale, he gets to manipulate things. Now, the notion that someone wants to murder her child upsets Dany to the point that it triggers these feelings.
He would not weep, she decided. She would not weep, she decided. She would not shiver with fear.
Yeah, again, Dany's fear is associated with shivering. Shivering is a common refrain for her, as we pointed out last episode. But that's just a side point I wanted to remind you all of. Here's the main thing.
The usurper had woken the dragon now, she told herself, and her eyes went to the dragon's eggs resting in their nest of dark velvet. The shifting lamplight lined their stony scales, and shimmering motes of jade and scarlet and gold swam in the air around them like courtiers around a king. Was it madness that seized her then, born of fear, or some strange wisdom buried in her blood? Dany could not have said. She heard her own voice saying, Ser Jorah, light the brazier.
Some strange wisdom buried in her blood. That line is really huge. I mean, it was huge back then too, but I love the way that's written. Yeah, because what is this? Is this a prophecy within her? Is this voices of her ancestors like what she sees in House of the Undying? It's unclear, but she is compelled to do this. It's definitely not just her own will, though it's part her own will, I believe. But something else is happening. It's really kind of unclear. She shoves the eggs in and nothing happens. And then she feels foolish, wondering why she thought anything could happen here. But of course, only a few chapters later, she does it again with a little more fanfare and a little more, fire and blood. And it does work. But you got to think that, again, there's something in her, some sort of magical force that's compelling her a bit. Dany is not alone. Drogo is upset too about this attempted murder. Keeping in mind how Jorah is guiding things along here, he says to the Khal, remember, Jorah is partly behind this, so he's got to kind of steer things in the right direction.
This poisoner was the first, Ser Jorah Mormont warned him, but he will not be the last. Men will risk much for a lordship.
In other words, people will keep trying to kill your wife and child. That's what Jorah is saying to Drogo. Now, a warrior like Drogo has a very straightforward way of dealing with enemies. Well, you're coming for my kid and wife, I'm coming for you. He makes his vow beneath the Mother of Mountains, and it is a powerful thing. But declaring that he will rape their women and take their children of slaves is a clear sign that this is not good. And it's also a clear sign that it's not actually what Varys and Illyrio want. Well, not too much of it. They don't mind people suffering. They just want the Khal to lose. It's a bold plan, and they needed a Khal bold enough to do something no Khal had done before, while also expecting him to be beaten. So it's a real tightrope walk here. He yells as the stars look down and witness. And a moment later, Khal Drogo led them on his great red stallion, with Daenerys beside him on her silver. The red horse and the silver are the sun and the moon. My sun and stars, moon of my life. George likes to put that symbolism in there. And of course, with the red comet coming soon, it's about to get a lot stronger. A couple of notes from Sir Buckley here. At the beginning of the chapter, Drogo basically says, no, we're not going to cross the narrow sea. It's only because of this threat that motivates him. So kind of it gives the indication that either Varys and Illyrio knew they'd have to do something like this, or that maybe they were aiming for something that was a little harder to get than they may have thought. But it also indicates that Viserys was kind of right, that Drogo didn't really have any intention of giving Viserys what he wanted. Get a lot more of Dany's thirst for home than usual in this chapter. It comes up a lot. There's mentions of the red door, smells, and certain foods and things that take us back to certain places or times. That's kind of a very human thing, something we can all relate to. Smell triggering memory, and George does a great job here getting that same sense across. The lion skin here is really important. Remember, I mentioned at the beginning that Drogo went out to hunt the Hrakar, and we just had one king go on a hunt and die because of the wounds sustained. Here we have another, but this king is a lot more capable. He isn't. Drogo is not gone the way of Robert. He's still young and fierce and didn't decline. So it's also kind of the same kind of trick that George is pulling with thinking that Drogo is so strong and powerful and surely not likely to die anytime soon. But there's a little bit of symbolism here too. The lion skin, the Hrakar pelt, is given to Dany, and she keeps it until dance, when she then removes it prior to having sex with Daario, which is kind of a changing of the guard, so to speak. changing of the lovers, so to speak. And of course, eventually, skinning a lion is pretty important for where Dany is going and who she's going to be facing off with.
Mhm. Personally, I just wanted to point out, I hadn't really seen this before, but at Con of Thrones this year, there were multiple Hrothgar cosplay of
Yeah,
Dany.
it's kind of where
Like,
did that
there
come
were
from,
multiple
right?
in the cosplay contest, and I've never seen it at one of these conventions. Anyways, a little aside from me.
That was really cool. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'd forgotten about it, but you're right. It was kind of like, I've never seen Hrothgar pelts before, but there were, yeah, you're right. There were like 3 or 4.
Yeah,
it
yeah,
seemed
I
like.
know. I don't know. It was just maybe some of them agreed to do it together. Anyways.
Yeah, good catch. When Dany thinks it's odd that Jorah doesn't want her to come with him, she wonders if it's because he's going to find himself a woman. She thinks how some men are queerly shy about their couplings. Well, in A Dance with Dragons, when Jorah and Tyrion bump into each other in the brothel, he's with a woman that looks like Dany, so yeah, we know Jorah wasn't actually going to look for a woman in this scene, but indeed, he would not have wanted her to see that, so it's kind of a little hidden humor there.
Yeah, and obviously you bring up here that, Jorah's ex-wife, Lynesse Hightower, looks a bit like Dany.
And when he points that out, Dany gets like this kind of like, ugh, kind of feeling like, whoa, that tells me something that I didn't know that is not good. She gets creeped out, as she should. And when Dany falls during this scuffle with the Wineseller, she avoids falling on her belly, similar to when they battle outside Mary Mazdoor's ritual tent. So she's got these 2 cases where she almost falls down and lands on her belly, but manages to avoid it at the last second. Andrew M. and some others are keeping an eye on where Dany's ambition begins, since Viserys is the first one to kind of impart it into her. But while Viserys is always like, we're going home, we got to do this, we got to get the throne, she's not really that into it. She's like, she just wants to go home. She just wants to like have a chill life. But then she has this ambition for Rhaego. So she doesn't really have it for herself until later. And a lot of people think that it's kind of when she maybe bursts the dragons, that's when the ambition comes for her personally. Scott Wortman points out no need for iron chairs stands out much more now that we know that the Iron Throne is destroyed on TV, which may happen in the books as well. Good point by the Khal, saying you don't need that. That's a good one. Someone points out here that I was mistaken, saying Bayan Votiris is from Pentos. He is an Orvashi. Okay, good catch. Good to point that out. I was mistaken. Don't think it really changes the likely loyalty here, since the caravan came from Pentos, and given all the other details we laid out, but apparently the cultural connection is not there. All right, let's do Catelyn 8. The gang marches with the Northern Host, a.k.a. the one where Cat says, "You win or we die." It's the one where we meet the Manderley sons, Willis and Wyman, and see and learn more of the lords we just saw in Bran's chapter. Robb and Catelyn planned the campaign strategy, some of which he'd worked out with Blackfish in advance, and it's the one where we get a look at and description of Moat Cailin, a place we'll come back to perhaps more than a few times. I kind of hope so. I like Moat Cailin. It's cool.
It was too far to make out the banners clearly, but even through the drifting fog, she could see that they were white, with a dark smudge in their center that could only be the direwolf of Stark, gray upon its icy field.
Banners remind us of the, quote, perception of power, which is a major theme throughout the books. People like Varys and others bring up how much that matters. Melisandre, Euron. It's all over the place. There's a lot of it in this chapter. Cat's very aware how tough and ambitious and aggressive the other lords are, and how important it is for them to respect Robb. They review the letter sent by Sansa, and Cat points out that it's clearly Cersei behind these words. And she's right. Cat tells Robb that what Cersei tells Ned, essentially.
Cersei is wise enough to know that she may need them to make her peace should the fighting go against her. What if the fighting doesn't go against her, Robb asked. What if it goes against us? Catelyn took his hand. Robb, I will not soften the truth for you. If you lose, there is no hope for any of us. They say there is naught but stone at the heart of Casterly Rock. Remember the fate of Rhaegar's children.
Yeah, that's quite a thing to say to Ned Stark's son, and it's true. Remember, and she's right. You win or you die. And with Cersei, the one Cat is concerned about here, it all fits so nicely because Cersei's the one who said that to Ned. Cat's 100% right. Speaking of being right,
It seems to me that a man who has fought as many battles as Tywin Lannister won't be so easily surprised.
And indeed, Roose Bolton does a night march trying to surprise Tywin, and it doesn't really work. Some people wonder if that was Roose's intention. He knew he was going to lose, but I don't really think so. I think he would have been happy with a victory, but he took a high risk, high reward strategy. Let's talk a little bit about Moat Cailin. I call this part Tales from the Moat. A different form of power than the kind that's invoked by banners and crowns is sorcery, and that's mentioned here as well.
The gatehouse tower looked sound enough and even boasted a few feet of standing wall to either side of it. The drunkard's tower, off in the bog where the south and west walls had once met, leaned like a man about to spew a bellyful of wine into the gutter. And the tall, slender children's tower, where legend said the children of the forest had once called upon their nameless gods to send the hammer of the waters, had lost half its crown. It looked as if some great beast had taken a bite out of the crenellations along the tower top and spit the rubble across the bog. All three towers were green with moss. A tree was growing out between the stones on the north side of the gatehouse tower, its gnarled limbs festooned with ropey white blankets of ghost skin.
What is ghost skin? Some kind of hanging moss, I suppose, like Spanish moss, perhaps,
It
white?
could be ghost skin.
We have-
Actually, that's terrible. The idea of like ghost skin, actually, like their skins, you know, if Ramsay like displaying them all over Winterfell.
Whoa, yikes.
Anyways, it actually can be really dark if you look at it as that word. But
That's
no,
true.
it probably is ghost skin.
Yeah.
Ghost skin.
Well, the Hammer of the Waters, of course, is referred to here. We wonder if it's a real event or just a story. Did the children actually flood the area? Was it some sort of natural event or I don't know? Good question. More quoting here.
Just beyond, through the mists, she glimpsed the walls and towers of Moat Cailin, or what remained of them. Immense blocks of black basalt, each as large as a crofter's cottage, lay scattered and tumbled like a child's wooden blocks, half sunk in the soft, boggy soil. Nothing else remained of a curtain wall that had once stood as high as Winterfell's. The wooden keep was gone entirely, rotted away 1,000 years past, with not so much as a timber to mark where it had stood. All that was left of the great stronghold of the first men were 3 towers, 3 where there had once been 20, if the tale-tellers could be believed.
20. The immense black basalt blocks, quote, each as large as a crofter's cottage, are not the product of simplistic builders and could be evidence of giants, Brandon the Builder, sorcery, or all of the above. 20. There are only 3 now. Perhaps, though, if we're thinking the Hammer of the Waters broke this area, perhaps it was called to smash this castle. You know, I mean, to me, that makes more sense in some ways, that a large piece of sorcery would take out a work of humanity that the children didn't want to see there. Because otherwise, we're left with the idea that they built in the swamp, which is certainly possible, but that's has its own problems, all kinds of problems. So anyway, this is what we're told, though, is that this is where the magic was called down, as in they were in this fortress when they called down this sorcery. And they not only was the sorcery called down here to make this swamp, but it was the same spot where the spell was cast to break the arm of Dorne, which may indicate that this is some sort of hinge of the world. The fact that they apparently used the same spot twice is very telling. So regardless of what all the purpose was, regardless if the stories are wrong, it was effective in keeping out the Andals and is still effective in keeping out southern invaders. It's a huge deterrent. It may have been even more effective in that regard back when it had walls and 20 towers, though. On the other hand, one of the towers is called the Children's Tower. And when we say that the spells were called down on Dorne, on this broken arm of Dorne, and here, it's said that the Children's Tower is where those spells were cast. It strikes me as odd that the children would cast spells from atop a tower. I would think that that's the kind of thing they would do in front of a heart tree or many heart trees, like on the Isle of Faces, or like in that Grove of 31 where the Ghost of Highheart hangs out, or in the Grove of 9 beyond the wall. Something ain't quite right about these legends, is what I'm saying. Or several somethings. Definitely more food for thought. Keep all that in mind. What you hear about Moat Cailin, some of it doesn't really add up. Some of it kind of contradicts itself in some ways. And I think that there is hope for us to learn more later, but do not take it at face value. The first one to kneel to Lady Catelyn is Helman Tallheart, and the last is Theon. Theon later captures Helman Tallheart's son, Sir Benfred, after ambushing him and killing his men. Then Aeron Damphair drowns Sir Benfred. Roose Bolton asks Cat if she has Tyrion as hostage still and says, I vow we would make good use of such a hostage. He does that with Jaime instead later.
Roose Bolton, Robb said it once. That man scares me. Then let us pray he will scare Tywin Lannister as well.
He scares him enough to work with him later instead. Or no, in part because of the Jaime hostage bit, rather not keeping Jaime as a hostage, right? He has that line with Jaime where he says, and Lannister enmity means little to Bolton. And Jaime says, but Lannister friendship could mean a lot. And Jaime thinks he knows what game is being played here. Indeed he does. Indeed he does. Now, we love the mention here that Robb says, father's friend Howland Reed. And, well, they're the ones who give Victarion fits much later when he takes this Moat Cailin during Balon's second rebellion. Some notes from Sir Buckley. Cat takes over from Bran as the POV, keeping an eye on Robb. Robb, like Ned, can be forgiven for thinking that Lysa and the Vale would join the Robert's Rebellion 2.0 alliance, is what he's calling it. And Ned, in fact, has that same thought down in the Black Cells that the Vale will join with the North. They're both wrong about that. Cat has learned better, but at the beginning she would have thought the same. So, and Robb, you would think Robb has good reason for thinking this, because Lysa's home and child have been threatened as well. And of course, you need to work together to fight against Tywin. So, and of course, Robb doesn't know anything about Lysa. He doesn't know what kind of person she is. And he doesn't know how manipulative Littlefinger has been behind the scenes. Neither does Ned. Although he sees how manipulative Littlefinger is as he's sitting down there in the Black Cells. He doesn't really think about Lysa totally too much. Robb loses Tyrion even before he has him. Of course, which is too bad, and he's going to later lose Jaime. And of course, in both cases, it's not really his fault. And that's just kind of the tone for Robb's campaign, winning the battles, nothing else going right for him. And this is a key parenting moment for Catelyn. She's kind of fighting herself in that she wants to treat Robb as her son and protect him, but also knows that, mothering him in front of all these lords is a really bad idea in the long term. And you get this sort of back and forth of Catelyn being a great mother, where you get to see Tyrion a minute later with Tywin being a bad father. And this just is really big theme, something that is not all clear the first time through, because you don't see the full extent of how Tyrion has been impacted by his upbringing, and you don't know exactly where Robb and Catelyn are going. Sir Buckley also points out that it's kind of odd that of the way the three towers at Moat Cailin were distributed. Of course, Robb got the big one, and the Greatjon and the Karstarks got the other two. It seems like Roose Bolton is the more important lord here. On the other hand, we had that argument before about who got to go first. Roose doesn't care about going first. He's in it to save his men. So I'm guessing this was just a simple logistical thing where they get to Moat Cailin, and the Karstarks and Greatjon were there first, and they just grabbed those towers and were like, hey, these are ours. No one was going to take Robb's. But first come, first serve. And this is kind of like, there is no straight pecking order. So these lords are always kind of taking the opportunity to one-up each other. So I kind of see it as minor gamesmanship in that sense. All right, a couple other random questions. From John Hagee, we have, the children may have been greatly reduced in number by the time they tried the hammer on the neck. Good point. That would explain why the spell didn't work as thoroughly or as well as it could have if it's kind of a joint magic thing where each of them is maybe adding a little bit to the potency of the spell, or maybe there's sacrifices involved and with fewer people.
Kind of makes me think of our theories on Valyria.
Yeah.
Like we have like a bunch of sorcerers working to keep, these volcanoes at bay versus the idea of a bunch of children just working together. Just magic.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
it's kind of in reverse order, like the Valyrians are tamping the volcanoes where the the children are sort of trying to unleash it.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's trying to control nature, and that doesn't go the way you want. It's really hard to control nature. That's very cool. Abraham Gabayu points out a nice catch here. Moat Cailin has as many towers as the castles on the wall, and used to have similar numbers of towers as the wall. He says 19 castles versus 20 towers. Now, if I remember correctly, were there 21 or 20 castles, because some of them are abandoned? I think there's 21, but 2 of them were abandoned. As in, that would be the total amount of castles that's ever been on the wall, with some having been abandoned. I'm not sure. It's funky to do that count because you don't. It's unclear which ones we should count. But that's a good catch. You wonder if those things were in place at the same time ever. So in a sense, if you did have that, you would have kind of 20 castles-ish pointing north, defending from the north, and 20 pointing to the south. And that just makes you think of things like the 5 forts, which other people have brought up in reference to looking at this place. It's not the same kind of stone. It is shiny black stone, but it's basalt. It's wet basalt, which is not oily black stone, but it certainly got a few people thinking when we noticed that it was slick black stone. But it's different. Still, the size of the stones is very peculiar, and that's why I brought up Brandon the Builder and/or sorcery, because who can make stones move that big back in such ancient times? Well, the Egyptians built the pyramids. It's possible, but still makes people think. It certainly makes the current inhabitants of the area really, really wonder. But let's move on. It's time for Tyrion VII, the one where the clans meet the Lannisters, a.k.a. the Gang Meets Tywin. We also meet Kevin, quite a few more clansmen, and just as we meet a bunch of northern houses in Cat and Bran's chapters, here we get several houses of the west as the wars start to make their way to our pages.
Chella, daughter of Chek of the Black Years, had gone ahead to scout, and it was she who brought back word of the army at the crossroads.
Yeah, Prester, Craighall, Marbran, Lydon. Speaking of seeing power where power resides, the clansmen have never seen anything like it, and they are overawed. New clansmen here include Chella, Ulf, and Timett, in addition to ones we'd seen like Khan and Shagga, of course. We get some more backstory on these clans, that the Moon Brothers and Black Ears get along well, but no one gets along too well with the Burn Men, who burn themselves on purpose. In the history books, we learn much later that the Burn Men were formed from an offshoot of an older clan called the Painted Dogs. This offshoot discovered a fire witch in a hidden vale in the mountains and worshipped her. There is some, meaning strong evidence, that this was none other than Nettles, rider of the dragon Sheepstealer. It said that the Burn Men had to face her in her lair to get their burns, to prove that they had the courage to face her. That was long ago, and Sheepstealer is likely dead, Nettles surely so. So now they just use regular old fire. They keep the traditions going the best way they can. We also learned that the clansmen have really cool horses that handle rocks like goats. They're a different kind of horse. They're mountain horses, mountain ponies, basically. Different horses for different terrains. Tyrion gives the dead innkeep Masha Heddle an admonishment for what happened to him there, even though she tried to stop it, which is kind of dark. It's like, Tyrion, what are you doing, man? And Masha didn't have anything to do with this. It's not her fault. But that's also kind of how he sees the Vale. He's intending to bring blood and fire to the Vale just because of Lysa and Mord and a few other people treating him crappily, when in fact most of the people in the Vale did nothing to him and would do nothing to him. Yet here he is feeling so insulted that he believes the entire Vale should suffer for it. And who does he get that from? Well, Charles Dance was an amazing Tywin. It's good to remind ourselves, though, that he didn't quite look like Book Tywin. Both were tall and have the piercing eyes. Charles Dance has that going for him for sure. Book Tywin is blonder and has a shaved head with the distinct side whiskers without a mustache or beard. That's a pretty unique look. No one else in A Song of Ice and Fire really looks like that. And of course, the green eyes flecked with gold are very important for Book Tywin as well. His gaze is piercing, and of course, it's the same stare that put that one lord off when he made that joke about Tywin shitting gold. I love how George R. R. Martin writes the way Tywin wins the clans to fight for him. You know, there's a lot of back and forth in the fandom about Tywin as a person, and I don't think it's complicated. Tywin is a bad person, but he's clearly smart about a lot of things, and he's clearly really on display. His skills are really on display here. The way he just gets the clans to fight for him is masterful. Even Tyrion thinks so. And it shows off how much they have in common. It shows how much Tyrion is Tywin's son, even if there's a small chance he's not his sire. Kevin notably does not have this skill. He starts off by challenging and insulting the clans, and Tywin's like, let me handle this. Puts his hand on him and is just like, I got this, bro. This reflects that, Kevin is a lieutenant. He's an enforcer, really. He's one of his right-hand man, but in that role, he's employed to do violence quite a lot. He's very competent, but not outstanding. He doesn't seem to be a naturally violent or cruel man, but that is how he's used. He came up under Tywin fighting robber knights, the ones who had become allowed to root themselves in various places all over the West during their father's misrule. Tytos didn't handle such types, and Tywin did, but he used Kevin to do a lot of the dirty work. With Tyrion, they talk about the war so far, and among other things, we hear that Carol Vance and Mark Piper, who we saw in the throne room telling Ned about Gregor's depredations. Carl Vance is now Lord Vance, as his father was killed at the Battle of the Golden Tooth, where Jaime's men won because they had what appears to be a large numerical superiority. Joe says that we really need the Death Star music for Tywin's approach, which I think that's pretty on point. He also says Tyrion is thinking early on about how he means to change the clans and how they are merely seeds of an army to come. This is the first real sign of Tyrion entering the game as a player. Before that, like at Winterfell and at the Wall, he seemed to just kind of like traveling around, seeing the world, being a privileged Lannister, enjoying life. But something has changed in him now, possibly the near-death experiences, possibly the injustice of the accusation about Bran, just other stuff, just being powerless, seeing what happened with him. He's motivated now to get back at Catelyn and the Starks and other things like that, especially Lysa. Things have changed for him. It's more subtle because there's so much happening at this point in the story that it's easy to miss the fact that Tyrion has gone from not very ambitious to kind of ambitious or very ambitious. Also, we point out that it's maybe a bit of a plot hole, a rare possible plot hole that when Tywin is explaining what's going to be happening here and giving Tyrion all these kind of orders and telling him what's going to be going forward in the next few weeks and months, or what's happening in the campaign, and how he talks about getting a hold of Cersei and Joffrey and how they're ruling things. He also mentions how, if those counselors are working against us or if they're not obeying, then, put their heads on spikes. So it's maybe a little odd that Tyrion doesn't bring up Littlefinger's getting involved and screwing over Tyrion. He never really does get a chance to get back at Littlefinger for that. I love the joke that Shagga tells here, and I actually kind of missed it the first time because I just misinterpreted what was being said here, but it's so funny.
What brings you down from your strongholds, my lords? Horses, said Shagga.
Horses, yeah, literally horses are what they rode down from their mountain strongholds. Shagga is definitely top 5 funniest, up there with Ed and Stannis and Tyrion and Cersei and Jaime and some others. He's also a really big man. I mean, he's no Gregor, but he breaks a sword over his knee as he calls a dude Little Red Cape. I love it. Tyrion thinks how the realm will be different with Cersei ruling instead of Robert. And he's certainly right, though different is underselling it. It's why he gets sent to King's Landing to take over his hand. But of course, that's coming a bit later because we haven't yet seen the fallout from dismissing Sir Barristan and killing Ned. And Tywin says what Varys will say later this episode, that Cersei is worried about Stannis coming for King's Landing while Tywin is fighting Robb. And he expresses that right here.
The sooner the Starks are broken, the sooner I shall be free to deal with Stannis Baratheon.
Right on. That is the key. Stannis, as Tywin says, is more dangerous than all the rest combined. And Cersei maybe doesn't quite see it that way, but surely she fears Stannis more than some of her other enemies because he is a tested battle commander. And of course, as it's said, as he says himself later, I am not without mercy, thundered he who was notoriously without mercy. Yeah. All right, Sansa 5. The one where the Lannisters take over, a.k.a. the gang fires Sir Barristan. The one where Cersei and Joff make a lot of mistakes, and the council helps them. Varys is into all of these errors, and Littlefinger loves chaos and making fun of Barristan. So, some of the council helps them along with these mistakes because they like the fact that they're making mistakes.
The walls of the throne room had been stripped bare, the hunting tapestries that King Robert loved taken down and stacked in the corner in an untidy heap. These damn tapestries.
Yeah, the tapestries. Littlefinger much later asks Cersei for some of these tapestries, which might contain lots of depictions of black-haired Baratheons, perhaps a weapon against Tommen. It's the best theory I've seen, but it's not overwhelming, so I want to know what y'all think.
Littlefinger just has a real connection to that art. It speaks to him. It moves him.
Cersei clearly doesn't see it that way. She's not worried. Otherwise, she wouldn't have agreed to send some tapestries to him. She would have been like, "What's he up to? I'm not giving him that." She doesn't care. She doesn't seem to understand what the reason is. So, in the Winds of Winter, we may just see these tapestries and get a better idea why he wants them. Maybe it'll come out. It could just be a symbol of power. It connects him to the throne. It shows that he has friends at King's Landing. On the other hand, where's he going to hang them? The Eyrie is closed for winter, and he's down in the Gates of the Moon, which is, held by Lord Nestor Royce, who he gave the title to. Maybe they'll go hanging up there at the Gates of the Moon.
Yeah, little do we know, Littlefinger's trying to, amass this huge collection of art and have an art room dedicated to it all. Maybe he wants to become an art critic. It's his real goal. We cracked it.
So let's go back to the Red Keep. A lot of characters here are present. Most of them are covered in our Where Are They Now? Tourney of the Hand. It's for patrons only. This time, all of the Kingsguard are there, minus Jaime, and eventually Barristan leaves as well. There's a lot of naming of names, people who need to kneel or be attainted as traitors. Might do another Where Are They Now on them, but I think there's a little much overlap. So probably wait till a little later till some of these characters are re-arrayed in a different spot. There's some slightly off phrases here. I think some of the world building was incomplete, and I guess you just have to blame some of the court here for maybe not knowing all the proper names and whose families are what size, because otherwise we're just looking at some errors by George here. It says that Doran Mortell and all his sons have to come kneel. Well, he has only 2, and neither of them are the heir. So it would need to be his sons and his daughter need to come give homage. Mace Tyrell's brother are mentioned, but he has no brothers. So that one's just straight up wrong. Oh well. Ironically, the person most disgusted by many of the decisions made in this room during this scene is Tywin himself. Fast forward a couple chapters to what Tywin has to say about this, which is in Tyrion's final chapter in this book.
What sort of counsel are they giving Joffrey when he lurches from one folly to the next? Whose notion was it to make this Janos Slynt a lord? The man's father was a butcher, and they grant him Harrenhal. Harrenhal, that was the seat of kings. Not that he will ever set foot inside it, if I have a say. I am told he took a bloody spear for his sigil. A bloody cleaver would have been my choice. His father had not raised his voice, yet Tyrion could see the anger in the gold of his eyes. And dismissing Selmy? Where was the sense in that? Yes, the man was old, but the name of Barristan the Bold still has meaning in the realm. He lent honor to any man he served. Can anyone say the same of the Hound? You feed your dog bones under the table. You do not seat him beside you on the high bench.
Gregor,
hold on, Aziz.
Yeah.
Both when you made a comment during my quote and just when you started that, you were muted. I mute you often.
Oh.
So you can start that over.
Yeah, so Tywin, that is how Tywin handles his dog, Gregor Clegane, obviously Sandor's brother. He feeds him bones under the table, do not seat him beside on the high bench, doesn't show him great honors, just deploys him and uses him for brutality and violence, which is, heck, that's what Gregor wants. And so, just to mention, anyone who's listening on the audiobook version of this is another moment where I think Roy Dotrice really nails it. He nails a lot of the moments. Of course, there's some where his voice is not right for the character, but he does a great Tywin, and the way he handles this scene, this speech here is really excellent. Just want to throw a little shout out to Roy there. One of the few things that Tywin would agree with here is allowing Ned to live. It's that's like, okay, at least y'all got that right. But then, of course, that decision is reversed later, as we know, thanks to Littlefinger. Sansa notes here, she's pretty aware of the emotions in the room. It's something she's got a talent for. She knows that people aren't really pleased with the elevation of Slynt either. Not only is Tywin not liking it, but a lot of the other people at court are unhappy with it too. They also don't seem happy that Cersei just outright named herself to the small council, though Littlefinger's joke about the naked knight made a joke of Barristan's dismissal. Everyone laughed at him instead of maybe being shocked at this, breaking of tradition. Sansa thinks how Barristan's brother's laughing must have hurt most of all, but actually elevating Jaime to take his place may have been just as bad. In any case, she's right that Barristan is feeling not so good right now, and being laughed at from a man who is very proud is definitely, that hurts. That stings. Let's do the tale of Sir Barry here. I've pulled a really huge quote for Ashea to read, and it's important because this is all, not only are there so many parallels to Ned here, but Barristan's story, it kind of starts right here as he's kicked out of the throne room, and it's fun to follow his path to see where he goes from here rather than waiting for several books to see him tell Daenerys the story, because it all happens right now. It's nice to lay it all out at once and not, rather than break it apart, break it months apart. So Jeor Mormont will, in a few chapters, snort with derision when he hears Jon read the letter telling him that they sent gold cloaks to capture Sir Barristan. And he's like, what? Why would you? That's not going to work. Let's again fast forward, though, even farther to A Dance with Dragons. Here's this lengthy quote for Ashea. Not only is it fun, it has quite a twist at the end.
I walked from the throne room with my head held high, though I did not know where I was going. I had no home but White Sword Tower. My cousins would find a place for me at Harvest Hall, I knew, but I had no wish to bring Joffrey's displeasure down upon them. I was gathering my things when it came to me that I had brought this on myself by taking Robert's pardon. He was a good knight, but a bad king, for he had no right to the throne he sat. That was when I knew that to redeem myself I must find the true king and serve him loyally with all the strength that still remained me. My brother Viserys. Such was my intent. When I reached the stables, the gold cloaks tried to seize me. Joffrey had offered me a tower to die in, but I had spurned his gift. So now he meant to offer me a dungeon. The commander of the city watch himself confronted me, emboldened by my empty scabbard, but he had only 3 men with him, and I still had my knife. I slashed one man's face open when he laid his hands upon me and rode through the others. As I spurred for the gates, I heard Janos Slynt shouting for them to go after me. Once outside the Red Keep, the streets were congested, else I might have gotten away clean. Instead, they caught me at the river gate. The gold cloaks who had pursued me from the castle shouted for those at the gate to stop me, so they crossed their spears to bar my way. And you, without your sword? How did you get past them? A true knight is worth 10 guardsmen. The men at the gate were taken by surprise. I rode one down, wrenched away his spear, and drove it through the throat of my closest pursuer. The other broke off once I was through the gate, so I spurred my horse to a gallop and rode hell-bent along the river until the city was lost to sight behind me. That night, I traded my horse for a handful of pennies and some rags, and the next morning I joined the stream of small folk making their way to King's Landing. I'd gone out the mud gate, so I returned through the gate of the gods, with dirt on my face, stubble on my cheeks, and no weapon but a wooden staff. In rough-spun clothes and mud-caked boots, I was just one more old man fleeing the war. The gold cloaks took a stag from me and waved me through. King's Landing was crowded with small folk who'd come seeking refuge from the fighting. I lost myself amongst them. I had a little silver, but I needed that to pay my passage across the narrow sea, so I slept in septs and alleys and took my meals in pot shops. I let my beard grow out and cloaked myself in age. The day Lord Stark lost his head, I was there watching. Afterward, I went into the great sept and thanked the 7 gods that Joffrey had stripped me of my cloak.
Ned executed.
Sorry, hold on.
Oh, The twist there being that he saw Ned executed. Huh? That's pretty neat. I'd almost forgotten about that. And it's super poignant, not only because maybe, you know, he and Arya cross paths briefly, or maybe some other characters, but just the idea that Ned and Barristan have so much in common. Ned is not a great hand to the king because he's not savvy with politics. He's great in terms of his moral character, obviously, that he's the kind of leader we would ideally want for Westeros. It's just he isn't prepared to deal with all the politics and brutality behind the scenes. Barristan is similar. He's a man of honor, and we see a lot of similar things happening for him as he's trying to be hand of the queen for Daenerys in Meereen, where there's this similar things happening, right down to a conundrum with who tried to poison Daenerys. You know, we have even greater connections, like Barristan sees Robert killed, Robert of the Black of Hair, and then at Daznak's pit, Barsenna Blackhair is killed fighting a boar, and Barristan sees that as well. And while he's just watching, and people are just cheering and seeing it happen. And so there's just so much they have in common. And Ned Barristan being unequipped to handle some of the politics in the similar way. So I just think that's really neat. And there's more, though. Let's keep going. One part that Barristan left out of his little story here that Jaime brings up for us.
Jaime was amused, though unsurprised, to find that Ser Barristan had taken the time to record his own dismissal before leaving the castle.
Yeah. There's a couple things about all that. Just, it is really funny that Barristan is so proper that he was like, okay, I'm out of here, but I got to go write this down in the White Book. Maybe because it might be part pride and just as much it is duty, because he doesn't want someone else to write that, especially because he knows who it's going to be. He knows it's Jaime's job now. He's like, well, if I don't write my story, Jaime's going to do it, and he does not like Jaime. Now, a couple other things about this long story that we had Ashea read. It's neat, too, that he... whoops, where am I here? It's neat, too, that he's... that we're talking about Varys and how he's the one who informs Barristan that he's been given this keep and these servants. And he says it comes from Tywin. He says, Tywin has granted you a tract of land. Well, that's a lie. As we just showed, Tywin was clearly against all this, since he said there was no sense in dismissing Barristan in the first place. So clearly he didn't agree to give Barristan this tract of land. If he would have seen a letter saying, hey, can you give Barristan a tract of land? He would have been like, no, don't dismiss him from the Kingsguard. That's the kind of response he would have had. So he didn't even know about this. So my guess is and of course Tywin wouldn't want Jaime to take Barristan's place as Lord Commander either, because Tywin wants Jaime to leave the Kingsguard, and it's not easier to leave when you're Lord Commander. So my take here is that I think Varys is speaking with Cersei's words, that Cersei told Varys to say this, and because she is the one who made this promise about the tract of land, because clearly Tywin did not make that promise. But Varys may have suggested the offer, said, hey, Cersei, maybe we should do something like this, because he knows in a way that Cersei and certainly Joff neither know or maybe don't know, definitely don't care, that this would be such an insult to Barristan. He says, but I spit on your pity, a hall to die in. This is such an insult to him. Varys knows it's going to be an insult. So since Barristan lends honor to any cause, as Tywin says, it's easy to see his value for Daenerys and the Varys/Illyrio cause. They can't really send Barristan to the Golden Company, even though Fagon's their main guy. They can't send Barristan to the Golden Company since he's the guy that literally killed Meleys the Monstrous. That's not there might be some bad blood there. They might think they can smooth that over in the long term, but you don't just send him right over there and just let that work itself out. It just might not go well. Besides, they wanted young Griff to marry Dany. So if you send Barristan to Dany, he's fighting for them both anyway. That's all going to just come together if their plan works out, which that's a whole nother matter, whether their plan's actually going to work out or not. Plus, Barristan is aware of Daenerys, given his place on the Small Council, right? He's heard about all these talk about trying to murder her, and so he knows she's out there, which he doesn't know that Fagon/Young Griff is out there, probably. Assuming they didn't tell him. So it's a simple matter for Illyrio to give him what he wants, give Barristan what he wants, like help him find Daenerys, and by doing so, help win Barristan's trust, and Dany's too. Like, Dany gets to say, oh, hey, Illyrio just sent me the most famous knight in Westeros to help me out. Well, that looks good. That looks real good for Illyrio. And it looks real good for Barristan, too. It looks good for all of them. And if that's not enough, Barristan can vouch for Jon Connington's devotion to Rhaegar. Because, again, their plan is for Jon and Aegon and Dany to become one faction. And that would include Jon Connington. And so someone who can vouch for Jon Connington being really devoted to Rhaegar is important. It shows that this person can be trusted. That may not happen now, but at the time, way back here in book 1, lining all these pieces up, lining Barristan up with Connington and his loyalty is pretty important. Now, one question I have is whether Illyrio and Varys knew or cared about the possibility that Barristan would out Ser Jorah. Remember, Barristan was on the council to hearing all of Ser Jorah's spying news. That might have been exactly what they wanted. It might have played into their hands perfectly. They're like, well, we don't need this informer anymore. Ser Jorah's been informing on Dany. Now we don't need that anymore. He's shamed. People don't really like him in Westeros. He doesn't have a good reputation. So getting rid of him might be a good idea to make Dany look better. And what better replacement for a shamed knight than Barristan the Bold? Like, you go from a shamed guy to the most proud, the guy that everyone loves. So, boom. That's just slam dunk for Varys and Illyrio's plans there. So, that's a whole lot about Barristan. Back to Sansa here. As Sansa said about Joffrey to her father, he's nothing like that old drunken king. And of course, that line led to Ned figuring about the incest. And here we have that same line, because he says, from the mouths of babes. And Varys repeats it right here. And of course, Varys is talking about the mouths of babes. He's had more tongues from the mouths of babes and wisdom, but still,
Varys said, a child's faith, such sweet innocence, and yet they say wisdom oft comes from the mouths of babes. So do the tongues that he has cut out.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's so gross.
God.
Wisdom also comes from the sign
innocence.
Language that they give, or the ciphers that they write, because they don't have tongues.
You know, people eat cow tongue. Is Varys getting by on some child tongue? That's why he's talking about how sweet it is.
Now, that's really dark.
I know. I'm sorry.
Damn.
It is really dark.
Next time I'm going to make you read more lady quotes. That was in this one, the news that Lady's Bones had come back, but I was like, I'm not going to quote that one. I'm not going to make a Share read that.
You could read it.
Yeah, no thanks. Now, of course, his purpose here, Varys's, is the same thing that he's telling Ned. He's not lying. He wants to keep the peace. He wants to convince Ned to lie that Joffrey is the king, and this is part of that. He's trying to get, hey, Sansa should say that. Sansa, hey, you too, Sansa, you toe the same line. We're all on the same page here. Let Joffrey be king. That's the peace that we want. Of course, Varys wants it for very different reasons, but he does want it. He is in line with Ned, sort of. So just as Sansa agrees that her father will say Joffrey's the king, yeah, he'll say that. Well, right after this chapter, Varys heads to her father to ensure that Sansa's promise comes true. So I want to back up to the Barristan anecdote and think about, just put yourself in the hands of, in the place of those guardsmen at the gate. They're like, just sitting there minding their own business, guarding the gate. And all of a sudden someone runs up and yells, hey, you, stop Barristan the Bold. Stop him, fight him. You're like, wait, what? I got to fight him? Are you kidding? That just ain't fair. That's just a bad day for those guardsmen. Yeah, tough life there. So a couple notes from Sir Buckley. He calls it our first real glimpse of the comedy double act that is Cersei and Joffrey trying to rule the realm together. They don't work as a team, and they don't work as individuals. It's really well put, Joe. He also wonders if demanding fealty from the Martells and Tyrells is a bad idea. After all, to this point, neither of them have done anything wrong. So summoning them in the same sentence, you're basically lumping them in with the Starks and Tullys. It's basically saying you need to kneel, as if they wouldn't have anyway. Anytime the king dies, his heir takes over. From Cersei's point of view, this should be fairly normal. She's just paranoid about people knowing the truth, I think. and paranoid about people finding out. So she's using a heavy hand when really being more gentle and just kind of pretending everything is as it should be. It's like, hey, the king died, his heir is taking over. The normal thing that happens is you all come and give homage. But she demands it and says, if you don't, you're traitors. So she doesn't handle it the way Tywin would. Tywin would say, hey, velvet glove, come kneel. If you don't, then we'll break out the Iron Gauntlet. Cersei's just going straight for the Iron Gauntlet, and Joffrey's all about it because that's kind of his personality too, which shows you part of where he gets it from his mom. It doesn't get it from his dad, that's for sure. And I mean both dads. He doesn't get that from Robert. He doesn't get that from Jaime. He does get other bad things from Robert, but not that. And of course, calling someone a traitor, if you're called a traitor and you have no kind of option, well, you may as well become one. If it's death or treason, well, you got to go for treason. And the Tyrells soon declare for Renly right after this. So that was Cersei could have handled that a lot better. Now, it's interesting to point out Sansa's role here in this scene. It's quite brave what she does to step forward in front of all these people who are so judgy. No one was looking at her. When she comes into the room, she doesn't see friendly faces, so she's already kind of isolated and alone, and probably not feeling really confident. But she finds that confidence. It's so important for her. She knows she's trying to save her father's life. And I think that matters a lot. She's very poised here, and I think that's going to be something that's a big part of her character going forward. And it's the first moment where she's just standing in front of a lot of people speaking to the court. And it's like Varys says, it's very touching. He uses that kind of against Ned, saying, you should have seen how your daughter pleaded for your life. She was so sweet and everything. And it's like, yeah, she was, but it was also really brave and a harbinger of the kind of character Sansa is becoming. Very cool. One of the few good moments from this chapter, like good moments. Of course, the chapter's awesome, but you know what I mean by good? Happy moments. That's what I mean. We get a quick moment of Dantos in this chapter, and it's an example of just how isolated Sansa is. Because Dantos is like, hey, he first looks at her nicely, and then I think it's Balon Swan, maybe Boros Blunt, one of the other Kingsguard is like, does the old, hand across the neck thing. Don't talk to her. Don't look down. And then Dantos kind of leans off and looks away as if he was like, oh yeah, I wasn't talking to her. So even Dantos, right? You see Littlefinger chatting with Dantos. Now, it's too early for them to probably be formulating these plans, but it's great groundwork, as Joe points out, that Littlefinger is at least befriending Dantos or bringing him in, getting more comfortable with him so that you can, manipulate and corrupt him later. Planting a seed of corruption, so to speak. A few miscellaneous things here. Cersei has herself, in addition to naming herself to the council, she has herself entitled Light of the West, which is interesting because it's a title that does not come up again. So I wonder, maybe if it does come up again, it'll be interesting. Maybe we'll see that. Maybe if she flees west and kind of hides herself up in Casterly Rock, maybe that title will come back. Interestingly enough, too, with regards to Barristan, we brought up how he slew Maelys the Monstrous. Not only was that a badass moment, but it was of an honorable moment. Not just because he showed off how great he was, but because it was avenging his liege lord. Selmy is a Stormlander. Maelys the Monstrous had, prior in the War of the Five Penny Kings, slain none other than Lord Ormond Baratheon, grandfather to Robert, Stannis, and Renly. So that is a big insult to the Stormlands that this man killed their liege lord. And so Barristan killing him was proper, in a sense. Okay. Making pretty good time today. We had an extra chapter. If it weren't for the extra chapter, this would be right around our normal 2-hour period, but we've got an 8th chapter, so let's do it. It is Eddard 15, the one where Varys convinces Ned to admit treason, aka the gang drinks wine down in the Black Cells. It's called the Black Cells because of how dark it is. The stones are still pale red like the rest of the Red Keep. As Ned notes during one of the brief times, there's torchlight in his cell. So in so many ways, this is like a straight continuation of the last scene. We got Barristan leaving, and we've got a ton of Barristan parallels that we've got more than we've already talked about. And of course, Varys goes kind of straight from that scene to here, to reveal what Sansa has just done and said, and to convince Ned to go along with what she's just convinced to go along with. And of course, the chapter starts off with a very lovely sentence.
The straw on the floor stank of urine.
No, it stank of urine, not mine. But that's not the worst of it.
When he slept, he dreamed dark, disturbing dreams of blood and broken promises. When he woke, there was nothing to do but think, and his waking thoughts were worse than nightmares. The thought of Cat was as painful as a bed of nettles. He wondered where she was, what she was doing. He wondered whether he would ever see her again.
So surely the first time you read that, unless of course you saw the show or had it spoiled by some mean person, you thought, yes, of course Cat and Ned will see each other again. It's how almost every story you've ever read or seen would go. But we didn't know what we were dealing with yet back then. And of course, now we do know, and we have different set of thoughts about this. Now we're thinking more about, we notice the tragic irony there, or the tragic plotting here, but we think more about the dark, disturbing dreams of blood and broken promises. Broken promise. I believe he might be talking about failing Lyanna and perhaps Jon. Perhaps that he was supposed to tell Jon the truth after Robert's death or something like that. Some part of the promise he seems to have failed. And well, until we know the promise, we can't know exactly how he failed. But the fact that he thinks of it as broken is a huge piece of the puzzle. So his thoughts turn to the tourney of Harrenhal. Now that's a huge one. A memory that will, of course, come up as part of several different POVs throughout the run of the books. Probably will keep coming up. It's probably not done. We haven't heard the last of the tourney at Harrenhal, most likely. We get it in Jaime's POV, Bran's POV, and Barristan's. Of course, Bran is told by Mira and Jojen, who learned it from their father Howland, and Jaime missed the event because he showed up and then was told to go home right after getting his cloak. So he actually missed most of it. So it's Ned and Barristan's point of views that give us the emotional resonance because they experienced it. And they feel similarly about it. He thinks of how all 6 Kingsguard were there to welcome Jaime, their newest brother. Contrast to the scene we just saw, where one of those 6 was just dismissed. Him, Barristan, and Jaime given his command. So, not fun for Barristan. But it's a really interesting contrast. Note that though Ned never thinks of certain things that would give Jon's parentage away directly, he does think of Jon plenty of times, but he never thinks of Ashara Dane at all. Not once. While Barristan's recollection of the tourney does include her. So it's interesting that we know she was there. We know all this stuff, and he thinks about the tournament of Harrenhal, but does not think of Ashara Dane. They both think of the tourney and Rhaegar giving the laurel to Lyanna, however. Ned thinks of the laurel itself, the blue winter roses, and again, the bed of blood and how Lyanna loved the smell of those blue winter roses. Barristan, on the other hand, doesn't really think of Lyanna too much. He does think of her briefly. He doesn't think about the blue winter roses. He thinks of Ashara and wishes he had beaten Rhaegar so that the Queen of Love and Beauty scenario had gone down entirely differently. So in some ways, Barristan is giving us the thoughts of Ashara we never got from Ned. The tourney of Harrenhal is also important because it comes during the year of the false spring, and because it ties the Eastern prophecies to those of the old gods with the Isle of Faces and the shadow of Harrenhal as an endgame last standpoint against the others that we spoke of earlier in this episode. How nice of Ned to give some of his last chapter to setting up so many other storylines. That's just the kind of man he is. Like I said, we clearly get more info on the tourney through not only those other POVs, but through the World of Ice and Fire. And there are still characters alive who could talk a bit more. Barristan is still out there. He's still alive, and he's a POV, so that's a good one. But he's not the only one. Again, Jon Connington was at the tourney as well. So was Jan Royce, so he wasn't a POV. And perhaps Arianne was told some things about it through Oberyn, such as, say, how Elia felt about being passed over. A lot of people still out there have information on the tourney. Jon Connington also has a lot in common with Ned. He's protecting a boy whose identity must be kept secret. And of course, he thinks it's Rhaegar's kid, whereas in Ned's case, he really is protecting Rhaegar's kid. So as you can see, it's this swirl of plot lines coming together, or starting to come together here, and coming together later as far as A Dance with Dragons and presumably even later after that. The Journey of Harrenhal casts a huge shadow on the past of so many of these characters, and the mystery behind it still fuels a lot of theories and a lot of fun. And of course, all these parallels are just overwhelming. I've talked about some of them in our Parallel Lives episodes or just in our Parallel Lives segues in some Fire and Blood commentary, and we've got more with that. I'm going to have to explore this one a little bit further down the line. So let's move on to Varys' part in the scene. Did you have something to say?
It was really dumb. You said down the line, so I was just about to make a dumb joke about down the line to Fogarty now. It was just real. I had to stop myself, and you made me say it anyways.
Yep. I made Ashea give a very obscure reference to the show Garfunkel and Oates, which is a really funny show that only had one season.
No one would ever get this reference except for you, which is exactly why I stopped myself.
But anyway, you should check out Garfunkel and Oates. If you liked Flight of the Conchords, it's got a similar feel to it, to female comedians that make funny songs and put them into their into the show. And
Apparently
it's got guests like Seth Rogen and other people.
Apparently, it's the subject of our new podcast.
Apparently,
today.
yes. We are now switching to a Garfunkel and Oates podcast, even though it only had one season. So, yeah, with Varys' part in this scene, it reminds me of Jaime in a way. The scene in the dungeon of Riverrun with Catelyn, because in both cases, they're getting drunk and trading questions. Also, it has similarities to his conversation with Littlefinger regarding making peace with our enemies and with going along with the Lannister deception, which is Littlefinger wanted Ned to go along with the Lannister deception, not putting Stannis on the throne. And here we go, same thing. Varys is like, hey, you got to do that. You got to not put Stannis on the throne. You got to just go along with the Lannister thing because the alternative is worse. He's way more diplomatic about it than Ned is, or than Littlefinger is.
You want me to serve the woman who murdered my king, butchered my men, and crippled my son? Ned's voice was thick with disbelief. I want you to serve the realm, Varys said. Yeah,
see, that's a much better way of putting it than Littlefinger, who puts it very self-servingly. He's like, well, this is better for us. He's not thinking of the realm. Varys is just smarter than Littlefinger in a lot of ways, and this is part of why. His reads on people are more cunning. I think he's a little bit better at manipulating because he doesn't have this instinct to make fun of people and to mock them. He's nice about it. I'm not saying he's a better man. I'm totally talking about his skills as an intriguer. And this is when Varys says in this scene, it's funny to bring this up now because this is the scene where Varys says that Littlefinger is the second most devious man in the Seven Kingdoms. He's obviously referring to himself as first. And I tend to agree. I do think that Varys' motivations they're less self-serving. It's Littlefinger's own ego and need to be a member of the nobility and also his need to mock people. These are weaknesses in terms of getting what he wants as an intriguer. He makes enemies in places that Varys doesn't. Now, here's more of Varys being really skillfully manipulating. And then he does it in such a great way that I think a lot of readers miss it, because if you don't add up all the plot lines properly, it's easy to miss where Varys is exaggerating or outright lying. So it's a climactic conversation and we understand it well, but as I said, there are some subtleties that can throw people off. Ned is totally ready to give his life rather than break his code of honor and the law, but he won't give his daughter's life for that. Varys pushes Ned a bit by exaggerating how badly Ned's mercy backfired on Robert. He basically convinces Ned that his mercy is entirely the reason why Robert died. That's not true. Varys says that the Lannisters would have gotten rid of Robert eventually, but he doesn't really point it as eventually. He makes it sound like they were definitely going to kill him on that particular hunting trip, which we know is not true. We know that it looked like they were going to take out Robert, but it wasn't a sure thing that would happen on this particular hunting trip. You could possibly interpret this as Varys saying they were going to kill him on this trip one way or another, but it just doesn't add up. Who's going to do it? Lancel? Lancel got Robert killed by just giving him wine, and Robert's bluster took over after that. What is Lancel gonna? Was Lancel's instructions to, if the wine doesn't kill him, then stab him or shoot him with an arrow? That just doesn't work. Lancel isn't that sneaky. I don't think he could pull that off. I just don't see that. So I take this as Varys just laying the guilt on Ned to push him where he needs him to be, which is to confess. And he says that confessing will save Sansa's life. But that's not true either. Killing Sansa would be a mistake for the Lannisters. She's a hostage. That has enormous value. And of course, as we see later, her claim has enormous value. So Varys is lying quite skillfully here, and and it's not just his lies. He uses another tactic to get Ned more compliant. Not only is Ned in pain and exhausted and feeling guilty, which Varys plays on to make him feel more guilty, he gets him drunk, which that's why I brought up the similarity to Catelyn and Jaime, because Cat thinks that when Jaime starts to get drunk, he starts talking more and more and saying more and more and revealing more and more. And I think that's where Varys is trying to go with Ned here, trying to get him to talk. He's trying to get him to agree. He's trying to get him compliant. And if he spills a few secrets along the way, that's good too. An open question in the fandom has been for some time, does Varys know about Jon's parentage? In the show, he doesn't learn until very late, but it could be different here because Varys is very different in the show. However, in this scene, he does refer to Jon as that baseborn son of yours. And more importantly, if he wanted to get Ned to do something, which is definitely what he's doing here, he wants to get Ned to confess to false treason. If he knew about the secret of Jon, he could blackmail Ned about revealing it, and he doesn't. So that's telling.
The thought of Jon filled Ned with a sense of shame and a sorrow too deep for words. If only he could see the boy again, sit and talk with him. Pain shot through his broken leg beneath the filthy gray plaster of his cast.
Wow. Yeah. What he does do is hit Ned right where it hurts most. I don't mean his leg. that would hurt. That would work pretty well. Cersei did that to Lancel. But besides that, not only does he threaten Sansa, but he brings up one of Ned's worst memories. And it's so skilled. Like, again, Varys is evil, but man, this is just the skill on display of how he manipulates Ned is just so masterful.
Varys, gods have mercy. Do as you like with me, but leave my daughter out of your schemes. Sansa's no more than a child. Rhaenys was a child too. Prince Rhaegar's daughter, a precious little thing, younger than your girls. She had a small black kitten she called Balerion. Did you know? I always wondered what happened to him. Rhaenys liked to pretend he was the true Balerion, the Black Dread of old. But I imagine the Lannisters taught her the difference between a kitten and a dragon quick enough the day they broke down her door.
That is a big quote. The Lannisters broke down Jane Poole's door too, and her fate is as terrible as anyone's. We spoke of Balerion the cat and how much he has in common with Balerion the dragon and Sandor, the one who broke down Jane Poole's door. He mentioned Rhaenys, though Gregor Clegane was the one who did for baby Aegon. Or did he? Varys, of course, doesn't go there in this scene. He's not trying to reveal that little secret just right now. Then there's this big line.
Tell me, why is it always the innocents who suffer most when you High Lords play your Game of Thrones? And then we've got the last line of his POV. The choice, my dear Lord Hand, is entirely yours.
Yeah, so boom. It's really, like I said, super skillful by Varys here. The thing about the dead Targaryen children, as we've seen throughout Ned's arc, is a huge traumatic memory for him. It's a source of anger and sorrow and guilt. And so of course, Varys is mostly, of all the things Varys is playing on here, it's Ned's guilt that he's playing on most. And he's even in a way here, he's sort of blaming Ned, putting Ned's guilt for the dead Targaryen children a bit on his feet.
I think you literally just said a memory of sorrow and guilt.
Memory of sorrow and guilt.
Instead of a memory of sorrow and thorn.
That's
obviously.
Pretty cool. You're right. That's neat. I almost brought up a very seminal, influential series on Game of Thrones here. And so, yeah, the other thing about this quote, too, there's the Sansa's life, of course, that's probably enough for Ned to be manipulated here, just worrying about Sansa. But he also gets the notion of if he gets to go to the wall. Varys points out that you get to go to the wall if you do this confession. And so that is an extra bonus for him because he feels guilt about Jon. And he says, and he's thinking to himself, well, if I get to go to the wall, at least I'll get to talk to Jon, which assuages some of his guilt. But of course, Varys wasn't lying about that. He didn't see the next part coming. He didn't know that Joffrey and Littlefinger would interfere and that there would be no wall for Ned, and that Varys's plans of delaying would fall apart because, again, Joffrey and Littlefinger forced the issue. Varys had almost gotten everything to work out here. Varys almost got things straightened out, almost got to see Ned go to the go to the wall, but no. The Game of Thrones played out a different way. It played out the mean way, not the friendly way. Joe Buckley says, I don't think Varys is lying when he says how interesting Ned is because of his honor and that he has met so few like Ned. Yeah, that's true. There are so few like Ned. He says that Maester Aemon says in our next episode, he'll say something along the lines of, then your father is like one man in 1,000. And that might be underselling it. And looking back, it's easy to see how desperate Varys is to keep Stannis away from the throne, given how he's just so much more competent. You know, you see all along that Varys loves the idea of Cersei being in charge, screwing things up. Littlefinger likes it too. But imagine if you did have Stannis in charge. He would be so much more effective at repelling young Griff's invasion. So much better battle commander than anyone but Tywin that's around, as far as on the Lannister side. And, of course, if Ned were to lie and go along with the Lannisters, then they would have him not on Stannis' side. Because if Ned is on Stannis' side, that's another competent commander that they have against them. And that's not going to go well for young Griff if Ned and Stannis are arrayed against him. They would much rather go against these less competent foes, Joffrey in particular. Because at this point, they're thinking by the time Joffrey is a couple of years older, he'll be fully in charge, and then the realm will really be in chaos because that kid's clearly going to screw things up. They would have loved to see that happen. They would be happy with Cersei going away as long as Joffrey was still around, as long as Varys was able to live through that. So, Joe also agrees that with me that this chapter really shows off what Varys is saying about him being more devious than Littlefinger. Now, of course, he points out that you can't underestimate Littlefinger, but he says, I see Varys as what Littlefinger thinks he is, and Littlefinger as what Varys strives to avoid. Yeah, see, Littlefinger is too flashy, too out in the open. His motivations are too clear. Even though Littlefinger takes pains to mask his emotions, he does random things, as he says to Sansa, to throw them off, to throw off people as to what his goals are. But he hasn't been able to hide from most of us, and certainly not from Varys, that he wants to be in the nobility. He hates the Starks. He hates the Tullys. He wants to marry Sansa and all that stuff. That he can't hide. But what Varys really wants, Littlefinger does not know. All right. A couple of QA things here, just a couple of quick ones, and then we will do our outro. Tree Girl and Ben LaSoul both wonder how Ned could have possibly navigated his way through all of this, which is maybe a sign that the government of Westeros needs to be reset. Not necessarily the Daenerys burn it all down style or her father's style of burn them all, but some kind of reset to the government, because it's just so corrupt. And yeah, Ned, no matter what Ned did, he wouldn't have come out of this well. And that's kind of what they're pointing to, that there's just no path that Ned could have taken that would have worked out. Being who he is and all, other than him just being a different person and giving in to corruption and becoming like the people he hates. All right, let's talk about what's next up. Things are really going to turn to more and more Daenerys, speaking of her. She has 4 of the final 14 chapters. The other 10 are 2 Tyrions, 2 Jons, 3 Catelyns, and 1 each of Sansa, Arya, and Bran. So, in that time, we will be having Catelyn 9, the Gang Meets the Freys, a.k.a. the one where Robb trades a crossing for a marriage.
Jon 8, the one where Aemon reveals his past, aka the gang gives Jon Valyrian steel.
Ooh. Daenerys 7, the one where Khal Drogo is wounded, aka the gang meets Mirri Maz Duur.
Tyrion 8, the one with the Battle of the Green Fork, aka the gang meets Shae.
Yeah. Catelyn 10, the gang fights in the Whispering Woods, aka the one where they capture Jaime.
Daenerys VIII, the one where Mary uses blood magic, aka the gang fights Drogo's blood riders.
And Arya 5, the one where they execute Ned, aka the one where we learned how different this series really was. In just this next episode alone, we'll have 3 battles. One on screen, one partially on screen, and one off screen. There will be blood magic, an execution, quite a lot of death, not even counting those big battles. So thanks very much to Ashea for wearing all the arms and handling so much. Thanks to Joe Buckley for the extra notes and help formulating the writing for this episode. Definitely check out Scraps and Scrolls, aka the Isle of Faces podcast. That's his jam. Thanks to our History of Westeros mods on the Facebook group for facilitating the great discussions that help us catch extra details and give us great questions to ponder that get us deeper into our understanding of the series. Thanks to Nina for the timestamps and for bouncing lots of ideas off of me and being one of our most valuable commenters. Thanks to Claridox.de, that's Michael Klarfeld's gig. He does all of our maps that we have behind us, well, almost all of them, as well as our video intro, outro. He also helped us find Kevin MacLeod, who we give thanks to for our Valar Rereadis music.
And we're meeting him.
Yeah, we're going to meet Michael Klarfeld in Europe in just a week or so.
I mean, no, it's
2 weeks.
1, 2, 3, 4 days.
Oh, 4 days, right? No,
in
it's
4
Worldcon,
days.
not TitanCon. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like,
Heck
what
yeah.
are you talking about?
Not 2 weeks, not 2 weeks. Less than 1 week. Thanks also to Jesse Koval and Jesse Townsend for the regular History of Westeros music that we've had for so many years. And of course, thanks to all of our many patrons at the levels high and low. We appreciate it all. Everything you do for us is super appreciated. We couldn't do it without you guys. And we look forward to continuing the series. We're almost done with Game of Thrones, but it'll have to wait a little bit. As we said, we'll be out of town, and we'll have other episodes posting in the meantime. But we will get back to Valar Rereadis, finishing Game of Thrones, do that Q&A with Sir Buckley and Lady Gwyn, and then get on our way to A Clash of Kings, which will be a different kind of similar fun. Okay, that's it. Until next time, everybody, Valar Rereadis.